My name is Ida DeBeery from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, and I have the privilege of introducing today's webinar. ITU is the United Nations Specialized Agency for ICTs, and we are also the core organizers of the AI for Good Global Summit, alongside the X Prize Foundation, in partnership with 38 UN sister agencies and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of the summit is to identify practical applications of the Sustainable Development Goals and scale the solutions for global impact. We are pleased today to discuss a regulatory framework for automated driving, the value of in-use data for creating a no-blame culture of safety. This webinar is part of the ITUT's focus group on AI for automated and assisted driving, which was generated from the 2019 AI Summit in Geneva. They are also having their meeting tomorrow after today's webinar, so we encourage you to join. Now moving on to today's webinar, we have a distinguished set of panelists, but as always, we are counting on you, the participants, to help really make this an engaging discussion. To do this, we'll be using the Q&A functionality, which you can find just left of center at the bottom of your screen, and as well, you can use the chat functionality. Please just be sure to set the message recipient to everyone, not just to the panelists. That way everyone can see your message. You can select this just above the message box. Now, before we turn to our panel, let's test this out. So I would like to ask everyone to go into the chat function, click send to everyone, and let us know, what year do you think that you will be using a self-driving car? When do you think this will arrive? It could be 2025, 2030. I'll begin. I'll go to all panelists and attendees. I'll say 2027, and we can see what you think. So please just type it into the chat and send it to everyone. And then now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Bryn Balcom. He is the chairman of the ITUT focus group on AI for autonomous and assisted driving, and he is the founder of the Autonomous Drivers Alliance. Over to you, Bryn.
Thanks very much, Ada. It's a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, the focus group that we run within the ITU started at the AI for Good Summit, so it's great to be actually sharing this webinar with them as well. We'll also be joined by the Law Commissions of England and Wales and the Scottish Law Commission as well in this webinar, which will be looking particularly at the Law Commission's consultation paper, their third consultation paper, detailing the regulatory framework for automated driving. So it's a consultation. The aim of this workshop is to get good interaction with all the audience and between all of the panelists. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists. I think first we'll just start with our names. So my name's Bryn. I think I said London is where I'm based. 2027 is when I think autonomy will be here. And I'm really passionate around the safety and the inclusion aspects that autonomy can bring to the road. So Jessica, if you'd like to just introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Guccioni, and I'm with the Law Commission. Let's see, the year I predicted was 2030 in terms of using AVs, and I'm in London, but I'm Italian, so I guess my heart is there. So that's where I would also call home. Thanks, and it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much for joining. Connor?
Hi, my name's Connor. I'm also a lawyer at the Law Commission of England and Wales. I predicted 2028, at least for some automated features. I think 2028 is when I'll be seeing them. And I'm based in and around London.
Super. And Lizzie as well.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a legal assistant at the Scottish Law Commission. I think my guess is around 2030 as well, although I can be wrong, can be sooner. And I'm based in Glasgow, although our Scottish Law Commission is actually based in Edinburgh.
Excellent. And then we have some, as we said, distinguished experts that are also joining the Law Commission panelists. So we have Nick Reed. Nick, are you there?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Nick Reed. I'm the founder of Reed Mobility. I was one of the expert group that provided recommendations to the European Commission on the ethics of connected and automated vehicles. So very happy to join the discussion today. I guess, you know, the question isn't necessarily when, but where we'll encounter automated vehicles. So there are some operating already. I've led trials of some in the UK. When we'll see them on the streets of London, could be a while yet.
Niki, are you there?
Hi everyone, my name is Niki Falca. I'm a postdoc researcher at the law faculty of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Sorry, I am based in Groningen and I hope to see self-driving cars in 2030, but with so many cyclists on the road here, I'm probably a bit too optimistic, unfortunately.
Yeah, very true, very true. And finally, last but not least, Siddhartha, either.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Siddharth Kastagi, Head of Verification and Validation at WMG at the University of Warwick in the UK. I actually can't predict when autonomous vehicles will be there because I first would like to know what autonomous vehicles are we talking about. So depending upon the application, the years would be very different. And I think we are going to talk a lot about that during the conversation today. So I'm based in Coventry in the UK.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. It depends is a very interesting answer to that question normally. So I'm just going to share my screen just to give everyone a little bit of an overview as to what to expect today in today's session. Obviously, we're here for 3 hours. We're going to take it nice and slow all the way through. There's a lot to actually cover. It'll be a fascinating debate. And as we said at the beginning, interaction is key. So if there are particular questions that you want to make sure are answered, please use the Q&A functions. If you want to upvote those, you should be able to do so as well. If you'd like somebody else's question that they've posed.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. So,
oh, hello. There was someone else. There was someone else coming in then. With the chat function, we can have two-way interaction in there. So if there's a point that you'd like to make, you can make that in the chat function. We may also pose some questions in the chat function as well. At a certain point in the first session and the final session, we'll be running a poll. These are questions that have been selected from the Law Commission's consultation. And it'd be really valuable to get all of your feedback on those answers. There's not many questions, but they're specifics to the topics that we'll be covering today. The first session we'll cover is this idea of a no-blame safety culture. What does that actually mean? What's the current legal framework? How does a no-blame safety culture differ from that? So what changes will we be likely to see? Top of each hour, we'll take a break. The second hour, we'll focus on the legal framework, the legal actors within the framework and their responsibilities. So that will be a really interesting topic because it will touch upon Siddharth's point about, well, what type of automated vehicle are we talking about? And then the final session running at 3 o'clock CET time, this is European time, will focus on the data required to support the framework. So being able to use that data to create that culture, that no blame safety culture of continual learning will be really important. And also for identifying who was in charge of the vehicle at any given moment in time to avoid any legal gaps between responsibilities. So I think that's the outline for today's session. Again, thank you very much for joining. Throughout the workshop, we'll be using two types of framing devices. If you've been attended any of the ITU focus group meetings that we've run before, you'll be familiar with the first one, which is the Molly problem. So the Molly problem is a thought experiment. It considers a young girl called Molly is crossing a road alone and is hit by an unoccupied self-driving vehicle. There are no eyewitnesses. What would you expect to happen next, both in terms of the behavior of the vehicle, the data that might be recorded to establish what happened and then lead to some learning that comes after that event. We'll make some adaptations to this because obviously when we originally focused on the Molly problem, we spoke about unoccupied self-driving vehicles, and that has a particular definition, which we'll come on to with the Law Commission report. We'll extend that to include user in charge, another term that you'll come to hear, and there may be assisted driving as well. But the basic premise will be the same. A collision event occurs, who will be responsible for their various different steps within that process. The second framing device will focus on a family driving scenario, a self-driving family, as I've called them. And this is kind of mirrored in some ways in the way I thought, if I had a self-driving vehicle, how would I use it? So yes, I could do the commute in the morning to the train station, but then I want to send the car home so my wife and my daughter can use it, and my wife and my daughter can then go to school, go into town to work, and then maybe, and this is something that Tesla has obviously been promoting for a long time, I can then, my wife can then enable a robo-taxi ride service using our vehicle. So we could, if we wanted to, allow that to be subscribed to a robo-taxi fleet, and then it continually drives around town offering rides to other people. So each of those journeys we'll go through in detail later. They each have different, bring out different elements of the Law Commission's proposed legal framework that we'll be discussing today. But I think that will end up with some fascinating discussions. So first of all, we'll talk about the no blame safety culture, but before we get into detail on that, I'd like to invite Lizzie from the Scottish Law Commission to just give a little introduction as to who the Law Commission are, what the consultation is about, and just some framing about what the outcomes from the consultation should be. So Lizzie, I'll stop my sharing now, and then hopefully you'll be able to take over from me.
So I'm just going to pull up the slides just now, if you just bear with me, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Jessica to take you through the first few sections. Do you see that okay?
That's great. Yeah, that's coming through fun.
Thanks so much, Lizzie. Hi, everyone. So as I mentioned, we've got quite a few colleagues here from the Law Commission. And Lizzie, if you can go to the next slide, please. Many of you may not be familiar with the Law Commission as an organisation. We're basically advisors to the UK government. So we're an independent entity set up by Parliament to keep the law of England and Wales and Scotland under review and modern and up to date and functional and efficient. So that's our statutory duty that we have. And it was set up in 1965. So it's not a specific body just for automated vehicles. It's a general purpose organisation dealing with changes to law and law reform. So basically, we have been asked by the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles in the UK to advise about what we need to do to change in terms of legislation to enable the deployment of self-driving vehicles. And I was interested to see in the chat, many people highlighted it's really difficult and important to be clear what we mean by self-driving vehicles. So that's absolutely one of the questions that we ourselves are tackling from a legal point of view, identifying the scope and remit of what it means to be self-driving. So that is in itself a question which should not be assumed and needs to be discussed and be transparent. We started our work in 2018, and we've done 2 rounds of consultation already. We've done consultation and analysis in respect of big policy questions around safety, around legal responsibility, and we're currently in a current cycle, in the last cycle of consultation. So that's happening right now. And the consultation started at the end of December, and it will be continuing until mid-March. So there's still a chance to share your views if you should wish to get involved. We would really welcome that. And the outputs from our work are going to be recommendations for legal change at the end of this year. And the idea is that government would then be in a position to identify whether it wishes to take them forward, and it would be possible to do so from 2022 onwards. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Yes, so just in terms of overview, I mentioned the meaning of self-driving, which many of you also highlighted as being crucial. How do we deal with systems that require human intervention? What kinds of environments do they need to be able to tackle? That's the kind of questions we consider as part of the legal remit of self-driving, and also the important threshold question of how safe is safe enough. Because someone needs to make that determination. We also consider the safety approval scheme, both before the vehicle is allowed onto our roads to begin with, as well as ongoing safety. So that's something that we consider, and I think that's the heart of what we're suggesting. It's a real priority to get a good system in place that can make sure that we have an appropriate safety assurance scheme for automated vehicles. And as part of that, what we're seeking to contribute is identifying the different legal responsibilities and actors that are needed to make this possible. So we look at users of automated vehicles and what kinds of responsibilities we might place on them, as well as fleet operators, which we see as another very important element, in addition to the role of manufacturers and developers, of course, of this technology, which are actually putting it forward for approval. So those are some of the key players. And then we consider civil and criminal responsibilities. The criminal side is particularly challenging because you can't just contract out of it. The criminal responsibilities cannot simply be passed on. So we have to be very mindful of where they arise already and what we want for the future, essentially, and how we do move to that no blame safety culture that Bryn was highlighting as being a very core part of what we're suggesting. And finally, data. We've got a very narrow take on data. We're just focusing on the data that is absolutely necessary to make the safety assurance scheme work. So we're not looking at the wider implications and economic benefits of data and things like intellectual property in data. Those are incredibly important and need to be dealt with, and government is looking at those directly. We're trying to take a more focused approach and identify the bare minimum that we need to make sure we have a functional and operative safety assurance scheme. So I think
that's great. That's great, Jessica. I think there's obviously a lot in there, because effectively your report is 390 pages long, I believe, the full report. So it's an incredible body of work. I have to admit, I've read the 57-page summary, which is in itself a really good body of work. I'd recommend everyone to go through that. Hopefully this session will give you an overview without you having to do the reading. But yeah, I really appreciate your time on going through that high level. I'm just going to share my screen again briefly. So the sort of no blame safety culture was really interesting to see, Jessica, as a term. Where did that originate? Because I believe there are some other industries that kind of operate this type of framework.
Absolutely, yeah. So we took a lot of inspiration and knowledge from especially aviation, I guess, in terms of dealing with incidents. And the RAC Foundation has been doing a lot of research in respect of how we might deal better with road casualties, even here in the UK. And it's just the basic premise that you're focusing on how to fix things and make them better for the future, rather than a more retrospective look at identifying what went wrong in the past. Although we are, of course, not saying that that's not important. And I actually think that's going to be a really big challenge for automated vehicles, is how we get society to come along with us on this journey and accept a certain degree of fatalities will still occur, because it's not possible to completely eradicate them, and making sure that they feel that these casualties, when they might and will happen, are dealt with in a way that is acceptable to them, and it doesn't look like a big corporation is getting away with murder. I think that is going to be one of the big societal acceptance challenges. But we are certainly focusing on a safe systems approach, where we're trying to make sure that we identify problems, fix them, and build that into future standards. So that's what we're trying to focus on, and very much looking at aviation is probably the main one, but there's also in rail and maritime, you have similar approaches.
Yeah, and I believe it was as you mentioned, in the airline industry, the idea of sharing data from collisions or from incidents that's done in a no blame manner. So you give over that information, and it's not, the intent is that everybody can learn from those mistakes, and therefore the industry itself overall becomes safer. I think that principle is really interesting to follow. So, Siddharth, just to get your view on that, what does a no blame safety culture mean to you? Like, when you saw those words, did it make sense, or did you feel there was some conflict there? Or?
I think from my perspective, that's essentially the target that we need to be focusing on. But there are a lot of assumptions around a no blame safety culture, around the different stakeholders that are part of this whole cab ecosystem, which involves the likes of manufacturers defining what we call as the operational design domain in a fairly accurate manner, the likes of regulators understanding and also communicating and agreeing that operational design domain, which is aligned with the manufacturers as well as the tier 1 suppliers and local authorities. So there's a lot of assumptions around this this concept of no blame safety culture, but that essentially is what we need to be focusing on, because we're not going to move the barrier of knowledge if we keep assigning blame on one stakeholder and another stakeholder. So it's all about collaboration. But again, at the part of it, every stakeholder in this ecosystem has its role, and we need to start defining those roles, and then only we will be able to achieve a no blame safety culture.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating to me, because the first time when you start to work through some problems, the first thing you do is look for blame. You look for who's liable, and it's a very interesting mindset to just go beyond the, okay, well, who's responsible, let's say, for that area, and then what do I want to impose in order to make sure that there's some improvements going forward. And I think, Niki, you've obviously done a lot of work for us in the focus group of looking at liability cultures, looking at regulatory frameworks. You know, what would your view be on the essentials to a no blame safety culture?
Of course, the idea of a no blame safety culture is very interesting, but it's also very challenging for a lawyer. Like you said, we always look for who to blame and who's responsible, who's going to pay for the damage, who gets a fine, things like that. So I think one of the things that needs to be very clear for this to work is how this no blame safety culture can be combined with the existing legal framework. How the existing legal framework needs to be adapted to make sure that criminal liability, for instance, is no longer an issue, but still, if something goes wrong, someone will get an incentive to behave correctly, basically. So that's very interesting from a lawyer's perspective.
Yeah, and Nick, from the ethics perspective, from the work that you did with the European Commission, how does a no blame safety culture fit into that overall ethics around CAV, connected and automated vehicles, in the work that you did?
Yeah, it fits very well, but the answers given are very reflective of the discussions we had in producing those recommendations for the European Commission. So the recommendations split into three categories: safety, data, and responsibility. So there was a whole section looking at responsibility, and yeah, trying to get away from blame, but focus on accountability and traceability of why incidents have occurred, reflecting that there may need to be adaptations to the legal framework to give everyone the confidence that that accountability, that traceability can be achieved. And then there was also a big focus on the safety culture of the developer organizations. So making sure the organizations developing the technology have the right culture in place to ensure that the reasons for an incident can be traced, but also that accountability works appropriately.
Yeah, I think that was obviously one of the themes that came out of the NTSB's investigation on the Elaine Hertzberg fatality with the Uber test vehicle. Was it went into a significant amount of detail, not just on the, let's say, the software system, the vehicle system, but the surrounding infrastructure, regulatory structure, but also the culture within the company. And that certainly led to an acceleration of the development of safety cases, for example, much more concrete, definitions and arguments for why your system's designed in a certain way.
Yeah, I think there's also some learnings from the 737 incidents and the cultures that have emerged around those crashes.
Yeah, super. Jessica, I had one. I have a list of questions here. We'll come back to those, but I just pulled this out from the Automated Electric Vehicles Act. So there is some regulation already that's been adopted that in the UK that defines, really loosely defines, let's say, what an automated vehicle is, what self-driving is. So this is designed or adapted to be capable in at least some circumstances or situations of safely driving themselves. And I think you picked out the word safely within your report. Is kind of the key term. Is what does safely driving themselves actually mean?
Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm. So do you
want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, as you know, currently in the UK, we don't have a permit scheme in order to put a self-driving vehicle on the road. One can do testing, and there's just a very general mandate in our code of practice that's been issued by the Centre for Connected Autonomous Vehicles to comply with the law. So you're able to put a vehicle, in theory, that may not have a human driver as we know them today, provided that you are able to comply nonetheless with all the different obligations. And that is the sort of baseline that we have. The Automated Electric Vehicles Act 2018 puts together a legal framework for insurance, because of course one has to have appropriate insurance to put a vehicle on the road. And in the UK, we insure drivers. So of course that's an issue. You wouldn't be able to have a vehicle that's properly insured if it didn't have a driver. So what the Act does is create a specific scheme for automated vehicles, saying that obviously the insurance attaches to the vehicle itself, like it does in many other jurisdictions anyway, but that's a novelty for the UK. And in order to qualify for this Act, basically the definition of self-driving is this ability to safely drive itself in at least some circumstances or situations, which broadly maps onto the ODD. That's how I read the some circumstances or situations. And then safely driving itself, that goes to what, when we think about SAE terms, you're thinking about the dynamic driving task and the ability to conduct that entirely through the automated driving system. And that brings in itself some questions about the extent to which you can rely on a human as a fallback, for example. So those are just some of the things that come up, but it's very clear from the wording of the Act that if a system requires monitoring from an individual in the vehicle in order to function, then it does not meet the definition. And that is very consistent with what the SAE levels say in terms of object and event detection and response. So I see it as very compatible with the SAE terminology in that sense.
Yeah, and designed or adapted kind of means like retrofit to an existing vehicle that may have already been, let's say, type approved or homologated, or designed as a bespoke vehicle. It could be a completely new vehicle with fully integrated equipment. So both those options exist here in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yes.
Yeah, super. And Siddhartha, you're my go-to ODD expert. So when it comes to circumstances and situations, when you see those words there and you think about ODD, what are we really talking about? What would be covered in your mind for those circumstances or situations?
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for embarrassing me also a bit over there. But just on this aspect, I think a key part of circumstance and situation is the concept of defining what the system can and cannot do. So when we're trying to define a no-blame culture, we are essentially saying this is what a system can do in a particular environment. So you're combining what we call as operational design domain or the operating conditions, and also the behavior of the vehicle. And that's a very interesting part that is often left out of these conversations of safety and trying to define the safety of a system. So it's defining the operating conditions, which includes some things like these static objects around the autonomous vehicle, the weather elements, the kinds of traffic participants that it might be experiencing, and more importantly, how the system would behave in response to that particular operating condition. So it's not only ODD itself, but it's also the behavior in that ODD that together will form a safe system. And this whole thing would be caveated by a set of assumptions that we have on the other entities in that scene. So you cannot define a safe system if you do not have a set of assumptions on other actors or other the weather and the traffic around the autonomous vehicle. So it's a combination of ODD, behavior, and also the assumptions that we need to take into consideration.
Yeah. Okay. And so I normally start, with.
If I may jump in.
Yeah, Jessica. Yeah, please.
Yeah, because I think Siddhartha makes it's a really big point actually from our point of view when we were considering this, because the difference with roads, because that's what we've been asked to do, is allow the deployment on roads, which is a very broad legal concept. It also encompasses the sidewalk, the pavement, for example, from a legal point of view. So it's basically public roads, public spaces. And the idea is that actually roads are chaotic, they're open systems, And that's what I see as the biggest challenge, is that we all have a right to use the roads, and they're not just necessarily for moving around, but there's also political demonstrations that happen in them. You can have stalls for markets and all sorts of different things happen on roads. And what I think is possibly a danger is that we might be seeking to constrain and somehow adapt, say adding jaywalking laws was something that I know at the beginning of our consultation was something people were considering might be needed, so that you could more constrain what you could predict people to do. I mean, there's questions with that anyway, because obviously you have to be able to deal with other people breaking the law as well. That's part of our obligation as good drivers. So even if somebody has lost control of their vehicle for whatever reason, you don't just plow into them because they're wrong. You still have an obligation to avoid them. If a cyclist is having difficulty and they're not where they're supposed to be, you still need to avoid them. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges if we think of road as that kind of open environment. If we put constraints on the road and say it's a dedicated way with excluding certain actors from it in a very prescriptive way, I think the problem becomes easier. You're sort of making the problem simpler. But I think if we take the ODD as you find it, if you will, which is completely open, I think it makes the whole challenge of self-driving much more difficult. And I think that is where the juice lies. Can vehicles achieve that to a way that meets the expectations of society?
Yeah, it's interesting, Jessica, in terms of the concept of ODD, do we license human drivers in a similar way? Do we have any restrictions that we place on drivers that they're not allowed to drive at certain times or in certain locations or in certain types of roads or in certain conditions?
So my understanding is I've got some colleagues that have adapted vehicles. So some colleagues that have certain disabilities with, they may not have arms, or they might not be able to use pedals. Some people have hearing loss. So of course, there's some adaptations in the vehicles that allow them to nonetheless drive and be licensed. The one that I think we're all familiar with is the duty to wear glasses. Sometimes that's a constraint on your ability to drive. But I'd actually be very curious to hear if there are. But in terms of if you get a driving license, other than the category of vehicle that you are licensed to drive, and the weight and the category, it doesn't say that you can drive on some roads and not others. That's what road rules are for. They sort of apply to all of us, and they tell us where we can and cannot be.
Yeah, and I think we had a discussion about the concept of progressive licensing that I think it applies in Australia, Nick. Is that correct? The idea where you pass your test, but over a certain period of time, as you get more expert, you're allowed to drive in more domains, if I understand correctly.
That's right. Yeah, a number of countries have graduated driver licensing systems. They seem to be very successful. They're often promoted as improving road safety in terms of giving you the chance to generate that experience, but where there are some guide rails on the amount and type of driving that you can undertake in your first year of driving. So yeah, certainly those types of system exist. I think there's also the automatic transmission license. So when you're only allowed to drive vehicles with a certain transmission type, as another example.
Yeah, and I understand some insurers for young drivers have incentives that they can't drive at night or they can't drive on certain types of roads, just to again reduce the risk of exposure in that first few years of learning. Jessica, I just wanted to pick up on the other public places, because that's kind of really interesting. That's thrown in there, might be overlooked by some people. But if I was to drive into a supermarket car park, this is now no longer a road. Is that what you would describe as an other public place, effectively?
Yeah, that's a great example. It's quite a simple legal definition. It tends to be anywhere where the public has access. So sometimes there's been cases about campuses of universities, for example, and how segregated are they? Because if you have a gate, for example, that only allows individuals that are members of the university to go in, then it would be a private place. But if instead, they have cases where they demonstrated that dog walkers could go, or people running could access it, and that made it a public place. So yes, as if it's a place where the public has access, we suggest that you need the same kind of protections and regulations, because in the end, it's all about safety assurance and making sure that people are safe. So We don't think it should be restricted to the formal definition of a road, which is a specific legal definition, but we suggest also covering public places for that very reason.
Yeah, perfect.
And that's really useful. Sorry, Bryn, for the trials in London, where we were trialing automated buses. We're talking to the police, that was in 2015, talking to the police about, well, are we changing the definition of a vehicle, changing the definition of a road, and changing the definition of a driver? The whole thing was up for grabs. There's so much uncertainty, but that's why the Law Commission's work is so vital, really, just to give us more certainty around what's likely to happen next.
Yeah. And so, Jessica, the other side would be if you're running a bus service, you have a depot, for example, or a delivery service, and you have a depot. That depot, because it's not accessible to the public, would sit outside the framework. So any automation that occurs in that environment would then sit outside this framework at the moment.
Yeah, so Amazon, Ocado, a lot of the current systems, you have warehouses which can be vast and wide, and they have a lot of automation already going on. And yeah, we're not suggesting that we would introduce an extra regulatory layer on that kind of aspect. There's also mining, lots of different areas where automation is already quite advanced, and it has quite different challenges in that regard. So health and safety at work becomes sort of a key framework to make sure your employees are safe, and it's through that lens rather than what we are considering as part of our project.
Yeah, excellent.
I just quickly make
a
point. I think I'm monitoring the chat. It's quite an interesting conversations going on over the chat. So just to qualify a comment that I made, assumption could also be that you're not assuming anything about other person's behavior. That's an equally valid assumption. Having said that, I'll draw a very left field analogy over here. We're not allowed to drink and drive in the UK for obvious reasons. And you could make an analogy saying that the reason behind that is because we are not able to perceive our environment in an appropriate manner. In a similar manner, if the AV sensors are not able to perceive the environment, why should an AV be allowed to drive? So you could link the whole aspect of, yes, there isn't any limitation on where we can drive or cannot drive, but there are a set of rules that we have to follow. Those rules don't translate 1:1 to an AV, but there is a translation possible, and that might lead to the concept of ODDs, it might lead to concept of behaviors, and some other aspects of it.
Yeah, super, thank you. And yeah, if you could keep monitoring the chat. As soon as I go full screen, I can't see the chat, so apologies for that. But yeah, if everyone can monitor the chat, and yeah, please, any questions that come up, any points that come up, please feel free to raise them at any moment. So I just want to drop back, because I wrote a few questions just around the topic. So we've just been covering how the UK Automated Electric Vehicles Act defines self-driving, no blame safety culture. We've just described that a little bit, but Jessica, what would be the benefits? Why would a no blame safety culture be required? What are we trying to achieve by having that? Safety is really the core objective from what I could read into the consultation.
Yeah, when I think about a no blame safety culture, I think the reason we highlight it so much is because it's such a change from what we have now. And I think maybe that has not been as appreciated in the public discourse as Niki highlighted as well. Basically today, when there is a casualty on the road, and we even saw it, to be honest, with the fatality with Elaine Hertzberg with Uber, everyone was very quick to blame the safety driver. It's true that the NTSB report had a look at the corporate culture and there was that aspect, but fundamentally a lot of the conversations were, we know the safety driver was watching The Voice on their phone, and that was a problem. And most of the other fatalities that we've seen, they can somehow be traced back to some form of human error. And I think although people have obviously been upset and people are worried about those fatalities, I don't think we've really grappled with the situation where you don't have a very easily directly identifiable human to blame when something goes wrong. So I think one aspect of highlighting it is to really, clarify the fact that when we move to a system of self-driving, there will no longer be a single human who's the last point of contact and had the ability to avoid an incident anymore in the way that we do now. And so we need to be thinking about really an algorithm potentially, and it might not be the algorithm that did anything untoward, but we have to move away from the idea that there is just someone you can point the finger at and that you can put in jail. The penalties for dangerous driving have just kept on going up. The government has consulted on making it something that could give you a life sentence. You know, it's currently 14 years. Okay. There's a lot of appetite from the public to blame when things go wrong. And we don't think that that same approach is viable with self-driving, because you have companies and entities that are going to be putting forward algorithms to do the driving, and they're going to be designing them and putting them through safety cases and doing all of the best they can. But if and when things go wrong, you cannot have as your go-to a criminal system, because they're genuinely, you don't have the same kind of behaviors. It wasn't the case that someone was necessarily distracted or drunk or having other impairments that caused the incident. It's more about possibly failings in the corporate structure. So we've suggested you do need accountability, and I completely agree with Nick. You need traceability and accountability. So where there has been misleading information or where someone has not made a disclosure, we think there is a place for strong criminal sanction. But where that has not happened, we think that things can still go wrong. And as one of my colleagues used to say, physics trumps ethics. So sometimes really with even all the best precautions and sensors, you might still not be able to avoid an incident. And when that happens, we need to understand why it happened and try and minimize the chances of that happening again. And for people to be open and sharing the best information they have, it's also better that they don't feel that they have a dagger hanging over their head, because they're much less likely to be open and honest about what happened. So there's a functional benefit of a no blame culture, because you'll get better information. And then you also have the benefit of using this information to inform the system of regulation itself. And so we can understand that in the scenarios, we hadn't accounted for an e-scooter coming in at a particular angle, and that wasn't tested, and it wasn't something that was within the frame at the time, and it did happen. And so now we need to be more careful about that kind of scenario, for example. And I know you'll come to it later, Bryn, but something that's very close to my heart is, again, also looking at other road users with impairments and making sure that scenarios really take them into account, because you can't just have a quote unquote regular pedestrian, whatever that means. We need to make sure it's really inclusive, both for people in the vehicle, but also for other road users.
Yeah, Nick, I think that was one of the points that you picked out with the ethics work that you were looking at, is the proportion of different groups that are affected by the deployment of these technologies, and how we might want to shift that as well, given the amount of vulnerable road users take the burden, if you like, for our mobility at the moment. Right.
Yeah. So one of the key points in the definition that was on screen earlier was that these vehicles can drive safely, and what does that mean? So one of the first recommendation of the recommendations for the European Commission was that automated vehicles should decrease physical harm. But we went further to say not only should the risk of physical harm decrease, but that no category of road users should experience an increase in risk of physical harm compared to conventional driving as a result of the presence of automated vehicles. So even if we were able to massively improve safety for vehicle occupants, if there was an increase in risk for pedestrians, that would be considered unethical based on our recommendations.
Yeah. And Niki, when you look at the sort of criminal and civil system, obviously the UK has exited from the EU. The Netherlands is still part of that. You have I think we've had discussions before, the legal system is actually quite different. It's predicated on different beliefs sometimes. So what's your view on this sort of no blame safety culture, and could it be something that could be adopted in Europe, and what would need to change there in order for that to happen?
I definitely feel that it could be adopted by European countries, maybe not the EU as a whole, but every single European country might find a way to incorporate this no blame safety culture into their legal framework. Sorry, the biggest problem is with regards to, as Jessica said, the criminal liability side of things. You don't want to immediately look for someone to blame and to put behind bars, basically. So that might require some adjustments. For instance, here in the Netherlands, you have many provisions stating what a driver should or should not do. And of course, without a driver, who are you going to tell how to behave in a certain way? So that would be something that might be addressed when a vehicle is approved, for instance, before it hits the roads, to make sure that a vehicle will behave according to your regular traffic rules, basically.
Yeah.
When it comes to, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
When it comes to the civil liability side of things, so who is going to pay for the damages? Here in Europe, we mostly look at the Product Liability Directive. That has also been implemented in the UK. I don't know what the status is right now after Brexit, but it means that all eyes are on the producer. Has the producer done anything wrong? Is his product defective? So for instance, if a self-driving car runs a red light, does that mean that the car is defective, or was there a good reason why it ran the red light? The producer has done several defenses to avoid this liability. For instance, he can say, well, this is a development risk matter given the current state of scientific and technological developments at the time the vehicle was put into circulation, and we were unable to detect this defect. And then he avoids liability. But still, nevertheless, you have this sort of urge usually when something happens that you think of when you now have a car accident, you get out of your car and you easily start pointing the finger at the other road user and you'll try to blame them. So it will be quite a shift for a lot of lawyers to move to this no blame safety culture.
Yeah, and Jessica, even though we're outside of the EU, I kind of referenced here the sort of 1968 Convention on Road Traffic. So at the international level, there are frameworks that exist. And so how does what we're developing here in the UK relate to that, that convention that I believe that we're signatories to? I'm not sure if we're fully signed up.
Yeah, no, we're definitely fully signed up. And the UK's been very active in that forum. So the way in the UK, international treaties don't have direct effect like in some other countries. So for example, in France, treaty conventions, like they have direct effect in domestic law. And so they need to pay a lot of attention to particular wording, and it's a very close relationship. In the UK, of course, we comply with our international obligations, but it's not direct effect. We need to import those international obligations into domestic law. So our road traffic acts are the means by which we give effect to the obligations and things that we sign up to at an international level in the 68 Convention on Road Traffic. And indeed, there's whole departments within DFT that are dedicated to road safety and making sure that our performance is improving, and that we're looking after the different aspects within the conventions on road traffic within our domestic law in a way that is appropriate. So it's absolutely relevant.
Yeah. So I think one of the clauses we'll obviously touch on in the convention is, I think, Article 31, which is behaviour in the case of accident. That we should be able to detect the accident, we should be able to stop, make the site safe, be able to, if it's serious or fatal injury, be able to call the police. Those types of requirements, and they are copied through into UK law. We have the equivalent of that within our UK law, as far as I understand.
We absolutely do, and all the signatories do as well.
Yeah, super. So I was just going to pull up, I think I put together a little slide. What was quite interesting, the Convention on Road Traffic is obviously managed by, administered, let's say, by UNEC WP1. But vehicle type approval, homologation standards, technical standards is those frameworks, those legal frameworks are UNEC WP29. And I just wanted to pull up, it's very interesting, both have recently, within the last few years, put out some statements around automated driving and about safety of automated driving and their kind of safety objectives, if you like. And And so where UNECE WP1 may say react to unforeseen situations in a way that minimizes danger, we see something slightly different in terms of the wording for WP29, which is shall not cause accidents resulting in death or injury that are reasonably foreseeable and preventable. So we have one that's kind of saying we need to react to those unforeseen situations, a bit like you were saying, Jessica, you know, accommodating for other people's errors that they may make, you know, not having so many assumptions about their behavior that effectively we'd say it was unforeseen. And another saying that collisions should be reasonably foreseeable and preventable. You know, we should prevent those collisions. So in shaping the UK legal framework, are we using similar language? How does it differ? Which one do we align more closely with, or we trying to accommodate all of them, basically?
I don't know, Connor might want to say a bit about this. I know he's been looking a lot at vehicle standards as well. All I would say is that there is definitely a tension between WP1 and W29's remits, because there is some overlap. WP1 tends to look more at the behaviors on our roads, whereas WP29 is more populated by engineers that focus on standards and things you can measure and put numbers on. And I think the two remits obviously need to work together when the driver and the behavior of the driver becomes something that is implemented through a technical, a new technology, as is an automated driving system. And I think that is a real tension. And there is the risk that sometimes in crafting standards, say in WP29, the nuance and full breadth of requirements on drivers today are not necessarily fully taken into account. I don't know, Connor, if you want to add anything.
I'd just say that, yeah, there is definitely a tension there, that one looks at it from a far more engineering perspective, the other from a behavioral perspective. I was actually going to ask you about harmonization of this, because I do know that there are joint meetings now between these parties and they are working together. And I think in the future, they will probably have to harmonize a lot more in relation to their definitions of what self-driving means.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely collaboration. They've been asked by their parent group to make sure there's collaboration there. I haven't seen anything concrete yet in terms of passing of information back and forth. And I think it goes back again, if you look at the, in the UK, we reference a competent and careful human driver, or a competent, careful driver. You know, that's kind of the definition for safe driving on the road. And if you fall below that, you could be classed as careless. If you fall far below that, you can be classed as dangerous. So, and then they have legal and criminal definitions, effectively implications to those. So really taking what does that competent, careful mean is one of those things. How do you filter that down? And I think we'll come on to that a little bit later in our discussion. But they're really those high level principles that we've used. How do you then, you know, codify those and turn them into things that you can test and validate against? You know, which is, I know this is an area that Siddharth is really focused on. So do you have any comments on that, Siddharth?
I would say it's an essential thing to do, but it's a really hard thing to do also, for all the reasons that Jessica has illustrated already. Because when you're trying to define behavior let me qualify. When you're trying to codify behavior, and given the permutations and combinations that are already possible of both the autonomous vehicle and also the actors around it, it's a fairly high dimensional problem. So it might be that we will start in a fairly secluded environment, and then we traverse slowly across to a more unconstrained environment. Having said that, I'm completely on board with Jessica's point around the fact that we cannot assume that everybody will follow the rules of road. So it would be a delicate balance between trying to constrain as well as trying to bring the behavior of other actors on board in the same codification concept. And it, again, I would say if we try to boil the ocean, it would be a bit difficult. However, there are a lot of benefits from the AV technology that we can reap if we actually deploy it in a constrained environment. But that constraint might be on the behavior of the AV, but the assumption would be that the other actors could do all sorts of things. I think that might be a good balance to start with, that the AV can do a few things, but the other actors, we assume, can do everything that is possible. I think that might be a good starting point for us.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think what's very valuable is when things are written down. So that's, for me, that's why the consultation is so useful, because you see things written in words and then you can actually really interrogate what those words mean. And I've done the same thing when I look at the reasonably foreseeable and preventable. And initially I was a little bit skeptical on that, if I'm being honest. One of the examples given was, and it's not, I should be clarify, I'm going to talk about a Tesla incident that happened in a foreign country. And I'm not saying that it's self-driving, but it just as an incident that reflects whether something's reasonably foreseeable or not. They're driving along in the outside lane of the motorway, and a van upturns and ends up upside down on its side in the outside lane of the motorway. So is that reasonably foreseeable? And was that collision preventable? And you can take different views on that. And I've heard different views from different parts of the industry. So some would say, well, that's a very, very rare event. We wouldn't expect to see an upturned van in the outside lane of a motorway. And from that logic, it's not something that they've tested in their simulations. It's not something they validated before the vehicle was put on the road. And from that perspective, I can understand that. But if the object is detected in the road, and it's detected, 5 seconds out, then effectively that is reasonably foreseeable. You have actually seen the object with 5 seconds, and therefore within that 5 seconds, it's preventable as well. You can take some action to avoid it. And so I think it's very interesting to look over what time frame do we consider that reasonably foreseeable and preventable to run. Are we talking about all the way back to the testing days, or are we actually talking about the current incident? Was this particular incident reasonably foreseeable and preventable, and what evidence do we have to support that? So that's what we'll be coming on to talk about a bit later on in the session. I think we've got 3 minutes before the break, but has anyone spotted any questions in the chat or in the Q&A that we want to handle just before we go for a short break?
You've got lots of questions, Brent.
We may have to allocate some more time to that in the next session. So, anyone in particular grabs anyone's eye?
I think
the question from Eric Barbier, we want to, Siddharth, I know you've mentioned you'd like to answer that live. I'm almost tempted just to hand that over to you to have a go.
I actually thought we'll all answer it, because I wanted to bring in the ethical side and the legal side. Because I think we could club Eric's question and Neil's question and Jack's question together, because it's essentially taking a manufacturer or AV developer's view on no blame, and if it's actually possible to expect an AV developer to say it's no blame. So I think the context of Eric's question is really interesting. So rather than focusing on blame, you're giving them a chance to improve. I think that makes sense ethically, but given this, the consequence of something going wrong could be fatal. I'm not very sure if giving a chance to improve is the right way forward. But at the same time, I would say there's a very important aspect that we lack in the automotive side of things is learnings from incidents. So if you draw an analogy to aviation, where any crash or near miss is followed by a thorough investigation and a set of learnings have been created, which are then implemented in the industry, I think that's the bit that would kind of address Eric's comment, but also be very beneficial for the AV industry per se. And that's something I think we do not have right now. I'm not sure if we have anywhere in the world right now.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's incredibly valuable. It's predicated on having the data to actually do that analysis, to do that learning. And that's certainly the third part of this workshop. Will dig a bit deeper into what data is required. What's the minimum set of data that would be required to enable that kind of learning, that culture of learning. So I think that's a fascinating topic.
I think if you've approached the challenge with the taking best practices in terms of design, in terms of human factors considerations, and something that is completely unpredictable has happened, then it is right for a no blame culture to exist. If there is fault and people haven't adopted those best practices for whatever reason, commercial advantage, whatever else, then it's a different situation, and different rules may apply.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting with the if you look, when we put young drivers on the road, there's a minimum threshold that they meet, but we also accept that they are higher risk and that there's a continual learning phase. So it's not that they're expert drivers, as soon as they get their license. And I know I was one. I crashed my car 2 weeks after I passed my test. The classic statistic. So, for me, it's interesting. Should there be a minimum threshold which all AV developers have to meet, which is safety, a safety critical layer, and then elements on the top are allowed to evolve over time. But never going below a particular safety threshold. So I think that's something that we can also talk about as we continue the session. So I think that would be a great time to take a break. We'll just break for 10 minutes. So we'll come back at 1:10 UK time, 2:10 in Geneva. So thanks all for your time. I'll take the time to have a little look through the chat. As I say, I haven't been able to do so because I'm on full screen all the time, but looks like there's been some really interesting engagement coming through. So keep the questions coming, keep the comments coming, and then we'll try and integrate those as the discussion progresses. So thanks very much for participating in the first half of this, the first third of this. Hi, so welcome back everybody. I hope you can still hear me okay. 10 minutes was a lot shorter than I expected, so it wasn't very much of a lunch, so I apologize for that if I'm still picking stuff from my teeth. No, I really appreciate that. Siddharth, you're 100% right. The Q&A is really interesting. I haven't had a chance to read all of it, but I think what we can also do, obviously through the focus group work, is that we can address those questions in more detail as well after the session. So I really recommend people attend tomorrow if we want to go into more of a detailed discussion on some of the points being raised. We'll try and pick out some, obviously, during the session. One of the things that I mentioned right at the beginning is that we have a poll that we would be interested to get the feedback on from the participants. Jessica, are you okay? Would it be a good time to run the poll now, just to get a first indication from people?
Yeah, sure. I think Lizzie might talk us through it. Yes.
Yeah, Bastien, would that be okay if we're able to run the poll?
Okay. So the first question comes from our consultation paper, and the question is: do you think that legislation should establish a scheme to assure the safety of automated driving systems following deployment, giving scheme regulators enhanced powers? And
Bastien, I have a note that says host and panelists can't vote at the moment on the poll. Does anyone else have that?
Same.
Yeah. I'd like to vote.
More power to the people. To our participants.
Let's come back to the. Bastien, we can give you some time. We can come back to the. Oh, it's ready. It's working now. Perfect. So, yeah. So giving an enhanced powers to scheme regulators, and Lizzie, that's really the safety assurance scheme regulators that you're talking about in that context.
Yes, safety assurance scheme regulators.
Yeah, and that might include things like being able to request certain types of data in order to enable the scheme, additional information than we have available for human driving as it exists at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay,
stuff like requesting data and.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the questions we ask is whether it should be a separate body to the regulator that gives the initial approval. So we ask whether you should have a separate regulator for getting the vehicle onto the road in the first place compared to the one that's monitoring it, to make sure that there is no conflict of interest. That's like a question that we ask. But this one focuses on in-use monitoring after deployment, which we think is an absolutely critical part. And I know also Nick's work highlighted that from the ethics. You need to check what is actually going on, not just stop your safety assurance at the point of introduction.
Yeah, I agree. Bastien, if we're having trouble with the poll, we can move on. We can come back to that a little bit later, I think. Bastien, either. Okay, I think what we'll do, Lizzie, we'll move on to the next session, which will be about the legal framework and the actors within the legal framework. If you can share your screen again, I think that would be great.
Okay. Sorry, it's just taking us a few seconds to move along. There we go. Okie dokie. So Connor and I will now be talking through the Law Commission's proposed framework for automated vehicles, the legal actors involved and their responsibilities. So the way we see it, there are two paths to automation. In path one, automated features are going to be increasingly incorporated into vehicles for general use. These vehicles will continue to have a human in the driving seat. However, while the vehicle's in self-driving mode, they'll be known as users in charge. As technology improves, what we envision is that the automated vehicle will carry out the driving task in more circumstances, and the role of the human driver will be reduced. In terms of path two, we see that more as selling a service rather than selling, vehicles. Path 2 vehicles will be deployed without human drivers in a limited number of sort of local contexts, hopefully to be expanded. We refer to these as no user in charge vehicles, and they'll likely have a wide range of uses. So that could be goods delivery or passenger services, for example. Path 2 vehicles will be supervised and maintained by fleet operators who will be responsible for their day-to-day operation. So I'll now hand over to Connor to discuss our proposed safety assurance scheme.
Thanks, Lizzie. So when we were coming up with our proposed initial safety assurance scheme, we obviously thought a lot about these different paths, and they've been something that we've been thinking about a lot over the last 3 years, looking at different use cases and how we might best set up a regulatory system to approve different use cases and different vehicles that are on the different paths. So this is what we've proposed in the latest consultation paper. It's essentially a two-step process for the approval of an automated driving system. The first step is the technical step. It's essentially the type approval step. So the manufacturer has a choice. They can go through an international route for approval. So if the UNECE, for example, has regulations related to the type of vehicle you want to put on the market, you can go and get your type approval via that route. But we think that the UK also has competence to set up a domestic type approval system. So if I perhaps just want to run a shuttle from, say, Brighton to London in the UK context, I might not want to get international type approval. So I might just want to go to the UK regulator and ask for type approval, technical approval for my shuttle that's in its very local context. So that's the first step. The second step is the categorization step. And that's a more holistic step that looks at whether or not the vehicle meets the legal definition, the UK legal definition of self-driving, but also whether or not there are various processes in place to assure the safety of that vehicle on an ongoing basis. So we've talked a little bit, or touched a little bit about how these vehicles are going to need ongoing monitoring to make sure that they're doing what manufacturers say they will do once they're out on the roads and being deployed and being updated. So we need to check those processes are in place. So at the initial approval, when the vehicle is categorized as self-driving or not, the regulator will check that the manufacturer, who we call the ADSE, and I'll touch upon that a little bit in the next slide. There'll be a check that they have adequate processes to update the vehicle, that they perhaps have done all of the relevant safety checks in relation to emergency services, local road rules, which might be unusual. All of those things are done at this step. It's a more holistic step. And then that categorization happens, and there are three outcomes. The first is that you're not actually self-driving. You don't meet the requirements for self-driving under UK law. And so your vehicle can be, at most, driver assistance. The second option is that you're self-driving with a user in charge. And that's very much the type of vehicle that we think about as being a Path 1 vehicle. It's something with a user in and around the driving controls who can do things like respond to a transition demand, or potentially do things like report accidents. Those are the types of Path 1 vehicles that will have someone in them who's in a position to take control of the vehicle, and they will be a user in charge, as Lizzie talked about. The third option is that you can be self-driving with no user in charge, what we call Newark vehicles. This will be a vehicle very much on the Path 2, which won't have driving controls necessarily. The relationship with, say, a user, a passenger, and this vehicle is that the passenger gets in and they have nothing to do with the driving tasks. They're not expected to intervene, and they certainly don't have anything to do with the maintenance of the vehicle. So there are processes in place that need to be there to make sure that that is safe. That will be checked at this categorization stage, and you will be classified then as a new user in charge if you meet those requirements. Lizzie, can I get you to change to the next slide? Thanks. So that's our initial approval scheme. From that come our main legal actors. The first main legal actor, which should be highlighted, is the ADSE. And that's the manufacturer or the entity that puts forward the system for approval to the regulator. And you need an ADSE for all on-road AVs. They're the ones who basically back up the system. They are the ones who are taking responsibility for it and saying that it is safe to the regulator. They have to have been closely involved in assessing the safety, and they need to have things like sufficient funds in case recalls need to happen. They need to have, as I said, processes in place to update the vehicle and make sure that it's safe on an ongoing basis. Other than the ADSE, you then go into your different paths. So path one, you have the user in charge as being another major legal actor. The user in charge is the human in the vehicle or in line of sight of the vehicle with access to the controls, and they must be qualified and fit to drive. They have to be receptive to a transition demand. They have to maintain and insure the vehicle, and they also have to report accidents. They take care of the things that are not the dynamic driving task. Buckling up kids in the back seat is a good example of the sort of thing a user in charge would also have to do. Path two vehicles will need a licensed fleet operator. That's someone who is qualified, so they have to be of good repute and professionally competent. They need to be able to operate remote supervision. We think that that's a crucial thing that licensed fleet operators running no user in charge vehicles will need to do. They need to keep tabs on where their vehicles are and be able to check that they are performing as intended. They will need to maintain and insure the vehicle, and they'll need to report accidents and near misses. So we think all no user in charge vehicles will require a licensed fleet operator who has those, meets those requirements. And those requirements we call tier 1 requirements. Now, obviously, some no user in charge vehicles will have very specialized use cases. So we think that there will need to be tier 2 requirements on licensed fleet operators who want to run these special use cases. So a good use case, one which we think is a lot of people are trying to achieve, is running passenger services, what we called in a previous consultation paper, highly automated road passenger services, or HARPS. We think that licensed fleet operators who run these types of services will need to have additional requirements put on them. Things like ensuring accessibility for people who are perhaps disabled. They'll need to safeguard passengers. And we think they'll also need to do things like provide price information to their potential passengers. If I wanted to run a no user in charge vehicle that was delivering goods, I think you'd have requirements like keeping aware of weight thresholds for your vehicle. There would probably be a threshold put on that particular vehicle by the regulator. It would be type approved. It would be checked that it could technically carry a certain type of weight. Types of goods, you probably have restrictions on what types of goods you could carry in your particular no user in charge vehicles, and you'd be responsible for securing loads safely. So those are the sorts of additional requirements that we think that particular use case scenarios would require in our scheme. But that is very quickly the overview of the approval system and the key legal actors in our system. The ADSE, which is required for all automated driving systems, the user in charge for path 1, user in charge vehicles, and the licensed fleet operator for no user in charge vehicles.
Super, Connor. I really appreciate that. I think Niels has just raised one of the first questions, and I think probably if you could leave the slide up, actually, Lizzie, that would be really useful, because I think it provides everyone with a good summary of the legal entities. But obviously, we've spent probably the last 3-4 years, is it now, with the SAE definitions floating around in the industry and the different levels, and how does, let's say, a level 3 vehicle fit into this structure? I'm assuming you would class anything level 2 and below as being ADAS, as an ADAS system. So actually not self-driving in the definition. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, I mean, Yes. So at the categorization stage, it's important that the vehicle be assessed such that it can meet the requirement of self-driving. And self-driving in the UK context is something that doesn't require human intervention or observation, we think. So yes, any system that requires a human to be in the loop, looking at obvious circumstances, we don't think would meet the requirements of self-driving under what we're proposing, at least.
So level 3 could be a grey area at the moment, because level 3 at the moment has some requirements that the human may step in if the system's doing something.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump in as well on the question that we received. It was only to panelists, but I'll just read it out in case it's helpful to broadcast more broadly. So the UIC makes no sense. There is a level 3 or lower autonomous system and no difference legally from driver assistance. This is definitely not a no blame system. Anything goes wrong is a driver UIC responsibility. So I think it's important for us to highlight what the user in charge is that is different to a driver, because the whole point of introducing the user in charge is that they are not a driver when the ADS is engaged. So basically you might be driving before, say you're driving up to the motorway, but we're envisaging as a use case a system where that person can press a button, and then from that moment on, they are no longer a driver for the purposes of Road Traffic Act requirements. So for example, if while the ADS is engaged, it were to run into the vehicle in front, or perhaps break a speed limit, we don't think it's fair to call the person might still be in the driving seat. We don't think it's fair to call them a driver. So it's actually a device which is specifically to avoid the placement of blame and liability on the person that might be driving before, but that doesn't mean that because you were driving 5 minutes ago, you were driving at the time that the incident occurred. And something else which I think is really important is that driving involves a lot more than just the dynamic driving task. In order to achieve driving, as Connor said, you might need to buckle up kids at the back. I have not yet seen any ADS that is capable of, buckling up Connor's 2 kids and an infant with a child seat at the back. You still need somebody who is responsible to do that and achieve that. So in a user in charge vehicle, that's the person that holds a driving license. We've said that's the right place, the best place in which to put those obligations is the user in charge. For example, if that vehicle is carrying passengers, the user in charge could help them on and off the vehicle. Again, something that ADSs are not particularly expert in, because the SAE levels focus on dynamic driving tasks, rightly, but there's a lot else that needs to happen, like insurance, maintenance, and that is the role of the user in charge, doing the non-dynamic driving tasks while the ADS is engaged and taking care of the dynamic driving. You've got a responsible adult that still deals with the many other things that need to happen, but with one exception, which is for transition demands. And that's coming to your point, Bryn, about level 3. We countenance that can be self-driving following the same structure as the SAE, because there is no duty or requirement to monitor the driving environment when the ADS is engaged, even in a nominally level 3 system. But the person might need to be receptive to a transition demand. And we think that provided that transition demand meets all the human factors requirements, which many academics have much better knowledge of than I, but certainly would need to pass that scrutiny in order to be able to be valid. So I hope that sort of addresses the question.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And it's probably one of the most fascinating areas. So I think some of the questions I've seen before are really, what's the responsiveness of that user in charge to a transition demand for level 3 is fundamentally different to the transition demand for level 4. In level 4, the vehicle is responsible for bringing itself to a minimal risk condition. And in level 3, it can hand off that responsibility to the human if it's given a suitable transition demand. So where are we putting in the user in charge bucket effectively level 3 and level 4 systems, and eventually level 5 systems, or certainly level 4 if you're just looking at a particular mode?
Yeah, I think if I may again sort of, and I know Connor might have additional things to say, but we don't think that the SAE levels are appropriate in terms of demarcating legal responsibilities of individuals on the ground. We could probably have a whole seminar distinguishing what might count as level 3, what counts as a minimal risk condition. And we don't think that is a fit for purpose boundary for legal responsibility. We think that there is a strong emphasis and importance of authorizing a system and making sure that it has an appropriate safety case for its ODD. And so we don't think that the levels per se are as helpful in demarcating that. So for example, if you are dealing with an area with a vehicle that maximum goes at 7 kilometers an hour in an area where there are no pedestrians around, I'm really exaggerating, but the kind of comfort that you might have in authorizing such a vehicle is different than if you're talking about a vehicle that's going at 70 miles an hour, you know, in complete mixed traffic. And given that we don't have accepted definitions of minimal risk condition, I think that's a key thing, because coming to a stop for some people might be acceptable in certain circumstances, even for a level 4, that might be all you can do. And then there's also the whole question that when you're talking about systems that are operating in such diverse environments, you can't necessarily in advance predict exactly, you know, what they're going to do. So you need to just focus on the overall safety case and the type of operational mode it's in. But subject to that, we think it's more useful to focus on how do we ensure it's actually safe for the conditions it's in. And that's like also the work Siddharth, I think, has been leading so ably and defining those circumstances, the assumptions, conditions, and that is more helpful than the SAE levels.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Jessica, is that I suppose number one, you need to be qualified to be a user in charge. You need to hold a driving license. So, in terms of accessibility, for some people with certain disabilities that exclude them from being a driver at the moment, they can't benefit from being a user in charge. So even if the vehicle is like level 4 and it's capable to take them from a defined location to another defined location, they cannot be a user in charge. Their only option is to use a licensed fleet operator service. Is that correct? So the idea of personal ownership for those people is excluded in this model.
It's not, we are not making a demarcation about ownership. So you could have like the way that you want to own a vehicle has no impact on your classification. So you could personally own a vehicle that is associated with the services of a fleet operator. So if you're completely paralyzed, for example, from the neck down, you may not be able to manually, you know, respond to a transition demand. So it's more a question, it's a observation of fact that you may not be able to do it. I should add, there are many disabilities where you can still drive. And as I said, I have colleagues that have lost limbs and are still perfectly capable of driving. They have adapted vehicles. So if you can currently drive in an adapted vehicle, and I think that needs more investigation, you absolutely can remain a user in charge. The only factor is, are you able to fulfill the non-dynamic driving tasks that are required? And are you able to control your vehicle following a transition demand, if that is the use case of a particular vehicle? So that's the only difference. But you could personally own your own vehicle, but the requirement would be that you would need to have a licensed fleet operator that was ensuring safety, because it's your own safety. But you also have to think about the people outside of the vehicle. You know, if somebody doesn't have cannot meet the requirements for driving, then it would be unsafe to unleash them on the road. Like you know, if you have, you know, a much older person, there comes a point where they lose their license, and that we do that for society. You know, it's a trade-off. I think what is wonderful with the possibility of AV is that you give them the opportunity to a wider class of people to have access to this technology, but it still has to be done in a way that takes into account the realities of function. So we're saying those functions can be dealt with by a fleet operator, which doesn't have to be Uber. It could be more like Apple Care. You know, you own your iPhone, but you rely on the manufacturer to push updates and to do various things. And it could be more along that kind of relationship. So we're not prescribing the business model by any stretch. We're just saying identifying legal actors that can fulfill particular requirements that currently fall on drivers, and how does it fall in a different scenario where there is no driver.
Yeah, and I think probably my point is that there'll be people that can fulfill the role, the additional requirements, rather than completing the dynamic driving task. They would be able to complete all of the other requirements, but at the moment they would still need to hold a driving license to be classed as a user in charge. Yeah, that's the distinction. And I think one of the other things really to pick up on is the definition of fit to drive, because that suddenly becomes like a really key point to this whole definition. What does fit to drive mean? So obviously the majority of self-driving promotional videos show people engaging in secondary tasks, you know, which but also sleeping. And in actual fact, we've seen people sleeping at the wheels of Teslas. So is sleeping being classed as fit to drive?
I don't know, Connor, do you want to come in? I mean, what I can say about that is that it depends on the ODD and it depends on the use case. I think for the current ones, like for example, ALKS, it would automated lane keeping systems on motorway is currently being thought of. It does not seem appropriate. Sleeping does not seem appropriate. I think it's a big challenge. And that's something where I would love input maybe on the chat, because I know we have Chris Tennant, for example, and other human factors experts available. But sleep is pretty unique in that you lose consciousness through it. So I think it's a very difficult one to authorize. So you, as I said, we don't use the SAE levels of automation to make our definitions. It just depends on the use case.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to that receptive to transition demand. You know, if I'm asleep, and I know within the Law Commission's report, you've focused on multiple senses being used to communicate the fact that there's a transition demand that's being made. You know, so that can be light, auditory, haptic, as far as I recall. So, but let's say someone's in a very deep sleep, they're not really receptive to a transition demand.
That could well be the case. I think it would depend on the type of transition demand. I can imagine potentially in the future technology that could assure or really make it very unlikely that you wouldn't wake up, potentially. That there could be ways of doing that. And again, depending on the ODD, it could be that a slower transition demand, it doesn't have to be 10 seconds like it is currently being discussed on motorways. There could be many other different configurations. So I wouldn't exclude it. I don't think it's something that you would necessarily exclude. I think it would require a lot of other safeguards in place, but provided that they are in place, it's not completely impossible, but that's more of a technical challenge and something for the safety case. And that's why we think it is quite flexible.
And I think something, obviously, from a user's perspective, they need to know where that threshold is. So, Nick, from your perspective, when you look at the definition of user in charge, how does that sit? What issues can you see, or what benefits can you see?
Just following up on that conversation, I think that the process of qualification might be different. In vehicles where there is much more support to the driver, there might be a different type of license eventually, where the vehicle can provide much more support for the driving task. And I'm interested in the fitness to drive piece as well, not necessarily from an individual journey where a driver might be asleep or intoxicated or whatever else, but on the likelihood of skill degradation, and whether a driver who has been using an automated vehicle for a long period of time, that has gotten used to the vehicle detecting hazards and responding to them, what does that do to their abilities? You know, the human factors research would suggest that they decline through lack of experience of that. So yeah, I'm quite interested in that kind of long-term change in skill level, if the automated vehicle is taking much more responsibility for the dynamic driving task.
Yeah, sorry, I can just say myself, I took my license out many years ago, and I have never owned a car, and I have massive skill degradation. So I just wanted to highlight with Nick, it's a real problem when you don't practice.
And with lockdown as well.
It's a problem for drivers that only drive in London and don't come out to the rural areas where I live as well. The ODD doesn't transfer. Siddharth, from your perspective, when you look at
a couple of points. just building on what Nick was saying and also Ed putting on the chat, I think a point that is very important to highlight is nearly perfect automation is much more dangerous than imperfect automation. And that's the reason behind that is you're just not prepared from a human factors perspective to take over for that small delta of nearly perfect automation. So I think within the skills degradation piece, it's again a function of the ODD itself. So for example, if you've got a very low speed application, I see that being less of a problem as compared to a level 4 motorway chauffeur system. And the point that Nick was raising and also Ed was raising about retraining of the driver, it might also need to be retraining for a particular system or for a particular type of system in a particular type of environment, because the skill set might be very different as when you're comparing a low speed application to a very high speed application. So I think that's another nuance which, again, a lot of human factor studies have been done, but I'm not sure we've taken that leap into training in different ODDs and the longitudinal studies that are required in this space. The other very important point that I think, sorry, just one more point, Bryn, that Jessica was raising, which I think is very easily forgotten. The SAE levels of automation, or J3016, was never meant to be a legal document. So it should not be treated as a legal document. So if I want to drive an analogy within the AV terminology, I would say the ODD of J3016 is not legal framework. So let's not treat it in that manner. So I'm completely on board with Jessica on that.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, I think we've had an overview, a little bit of an overview of the user in charge and licensed fleet operator. What's the responsibilities kind of for the ADSE in all of this? Because they sit at the top, but it looks like there's requirements that are imposed on user in charge and the fleet operator, and not really any specific requirements on the ADSE. For example, like being able to report an accident is predicated on the fact that you know the accident has occurred. So is there a requirement on the ADSE to detect the collision in the first place in order for then a third party to then report on that collision?
Well,
what's the position?
Obviously, as part of the safety case, you're going to have to tell the regulator how your vehicles will detect accidents, and the regulator can make an assessment. In time, with more experience, will be able to, perhaps provide standards in relation to that. You need to be able to for you to be self-driving, you need to have a system that can do X, that can detect, near misses. If we think near misses are sufficiently vital, it needs to be able to detect these types of misses. And you will need to present that to the regulator and prove that your system can do that. In terms of responsibilities, I think the ADSE, the key thing that the ADSE will need to do, they will be responsible for the dynamic driving task. So I apologize if I didn't make that clear. They will have to ensure they have processes in place to make sure that the vehicle continues to drive safely on an ongoing basis. So things like obeying traffic laws. And we know that traffic laws change all the time. Traffic regulation orders are also something that they need to be aware of and incorporate into their systems. Your local council will change the traffic regulation orders quite regularly, and vehicles need to obey the traffic laws. So if a bus lane goes in, the vehicle needs to be able to take account of that. That needs to be incorporated, and the ADSE is responsible for doing that. They're responsible for making sure that the vehicle drives safely and obeys traffic laws. So they need to be responsive to those changes. So we think that's going to be quite a big responsibility. It's going to be ongoing. And so as part of that, the ADSE needs to have a presence, we think, in the UK. And it needs to have sufficient financial standing that it can do things like issue recalls, issue software updates, and respond to the regulator when the regulator asks for something like, what happened in terms of near misses over the last 6 months with your vehicle. We think if you have a flexible regulatory system, the in-use safety authority can, potentially ask for these types of things.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Niki,
if that's okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if, for instance, the ADSE breaks a speed limit, then the ADSE would be responsible.
That's right.
What sort of tools would you have for the ADSE to incentivize them to stick to those traffic rules?
So one of the key things that we are proposing in this consultation paper is that as part of the no blame safety culture, you have a shift to a regulatory control system. So rather than have criminal sanctions on the ADSE, which we don't think in this context would be very good for ensuring adherence to the regulations, you have a regulatory structure. So you have a ladder of regulatory offences, things like improvement notices, fines, potentially suspension of authorization. That's a gradated system of regulatory tools, which the in-use regulator would then level against an ADSE. So if you have a speed infringement, the in-use regulator might feel that it's appropriate to give the ADSE a fine, but it might be the case that for whatever reason, the circumstances in that particular instance were unusual, that an improvement notice might be better, or basically perhaps just a notice putting the ADSE on attention. If it happens over a longer period of time, vehicles start breaking the speed limits regularly, then the in-use regulator does have increased sanctions to level against the ADSE. They can suspend the authorization. Eventually, they might be able to withdraw the authorization for the system. But before that point, you would be using these smaller regulatory sanctions to ensure compliance with the requirements that are put on the ADSE.
Can I add something as well? Because I think the point Ninka makes is really interesting, because you've got the sanction side, but the fact that the vehicle has run a red light, for example, could be a safety issue, and it might not just affect that one vehicle. So it's really important that you're not just dealing with that incident in isolation. It needs to be fed back to the regulator so that they can make the right checks and make sure that they understand and see whether other vehicles might be affected to stop that same issue happening in other vehicles. And it's part of that safety loop that we're trying to generate, because an infringement is no longer just as it is today. Let's slap the driver on the wrist if it's, say, breaching a red light, or obviously that's or even depending on how serious the infraction is in the case, you just deal with that. But we want to make sure that it's brought back within the wider frame, because it is a safety, or it can be a safety problem, and we need to be able to detect that really quickly. And that's why we think it's not really a focus on the blame, but we need to make sure we understand what happened, which could be quite complicated.
Super. Well, I really, it's a fascinating discussion. I realise we're already quite a long way in. I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, Lizzie. If you drop off, and then I'll share mine. And just run through just going to run through the 4 journeys that we were talking about. Before I do that, I just wanted to show a quick video. Hopefully I'm sharing the audio on there as well.
One of the most frightening things that can happen on the highway is when a car in front of you switches lanes to avoid debris. You have very little time to react because your view is blocked by the car in front of you. We have sensors that can see significantly better than a human driver can see. The Guardian is going to take over where a car switches lanes in front of us in order to avoid debris. Here, that car switches lanes, Guardian decides we have to switch lanes also, and we avoid having a crash. Now Guardian has offered to hand back control, and Ryan has taken control back of the car.
So when we think about what we've described as the self-driving family, this idea that it's like a personally owned vehicle, is able to take me or I drive it to the train station, but while I'm driving it, I'd say have something like Guardian mode that's active. Now, in the video that you just saw, Guardian mode is able to drive almost in an automated manner for a particular circumstance. So it's actually like a level 4 type function, for example. So in that regard, it's able to come in, intervene, and it will intervene and complete the DTT on a sustained basis until I choose to take back control. So while I'm driving, in this scenario, Connor, what mode am I in effectively? Am I a user in charge in this mode because I'm doing the majority of the driving? And then what happens when that switch is made into guardian mode?
Well, so, I mean, the guardian mode would obviously have to be assessed by the regulator first to see, you know, whether the human or whether the person using it was how much in the loop they actually were. I mean, obviously, if it doesn't meet the control and monitoring test under UK law, that you know, the regulator didn't feel that it was sufficiently self-driving, then it would be driver assistance at most. It couldn't be self-driving. So it wouldn't be self-driving with a user in charge. That would be, I mean, I've only just looked at it, so it's a bit hard to tell from that video straight up the exact limits of the system, but that doesn't, it seems to be a system that requires that the human be aware of circumstances, obvious circumstances. They need to survey the road, and they need.
Yeah, the assumption is kind of that the human has chosen to drive, but the system is constantly completing the OEDR in the background, and if it detects something that the human isn't responding to appropriately, then the level 4, let's say, automated system kicks in, and then it takes control away from the human, and then is able to complete the DDT. It can offer back control to the human, but there's a choice as to whether the human takes control or not. So while it's doing the DTT, it's a level 4 system. So.
Yeah, my understanding, and Siddharth is much more knowledgeable on this because he's dealt with it directly, but my understanding is that emergency systems that intervene in an emergency situation are excluded from the understanding of what it means to be self-driving from a dynamic sustained, because the idea is it has to be the sustained dynamic task, and it doesn't include emergency maneuvers. Siddharth?
You're spot on, Jessica, you're spot on. So any emergency maneuver is not part of any of the SAE classifications. All the SAE classifications are focused on sustained dynamic driving tasks. And because the guardian is not actually doing the sustained dynamic task, so I would not classify it within the SAE taxonomy. Having said that, your question is still valid to the regulators. What would they do with that system? It won't be classified as per SAE classification. I would treat that as an emergency system. So a very valid comment over here. It's the same concept as an AEB. So you could treat that as an AEB with lane change. So I would treat it like that, as Jessica mentioned.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Siddharth, is that and again, we discussed this with Jessica before, but the fact that it offers back control to the human, you know, the actual way the system engages, it has taken control away from the human. So it's not emergency as in a short intervention. And what you see with the intervention, as you're describing, it requires a lane change in the example that they gave. Is the system aware of the road regulations about making that lane change? Does it know that it can actually make that lane change and make it safely? And I suppose what we're interested in is if this system falls out of the definition of user in charge, for example, is there a requirement for the same data to be shared from this type of system as a self-driving vehicle classified under user in charge or a fleet operated vehicle? And so when that safety culture, where does it fit? Is it excluded? We don't get any data from these incidents, or does this data get included or not?
I think Jessica and Connor might be, and Liz, you might be better placed on the user in charge side. But if I understand the definition correctly, I would still say, because at the time that the guardian is taking over, actually it's the other way around. In a user in charge definition, the user is not doing the dynamic driving task, and it's only being receptive to the transition demand. Whereas in the guardian, it's the other way around. The user is doing the dynamic driving task, and only the transition is being done by the system. So I'm not very sure if the user in charge as a definition applies to guardian, but I'll leave it to the experts who've written the document.
Yes, I have to say and I've talked also with colleagues at Toyota, which I think as David Wong has put in the chat, I think it was just a panelist, but basically it's designed, it's understood as supporting the human rather than replacing them at any stage. So much in the same way that some driver assistance systems are very advanced already today, even though autopilot on Tesla is not self-driving, there is a concept that you switch it on, and then the vehicle is, you can talk about take over and take back, but that's not the legal definition necessarily. And if something goes wrong, say there can be all sorts of things that the vehicle might intervene. Automated emergency braking, for example, the vehicle does that. That doesn't mean that the person isn't a driver, but if that causes an accident, that person might be able to say it wasn't my fault. They didn't commit anything wrong because the AB kicked in. I don't think it follows that if something went wrong, you have to necessarily blame the driver, even today. So I don't think the two things are binary like that. You can have something that is very advanced driver assistance and still have a driver who is not necessarily responsible for everything that might go wrong with that system.
Excellent. Well, I'll leave that up to the discussion in the chat if you have any other views on that particular use case. So once let's say I've arrived at the train station, I then want to send my car back home, so it does an unoccupied return home journey. How is that journey covered in that definition? At that point, I need to have a contract with a licensed fleet operator, and then they would take responsibility while that vehicle's on the journey back. But in terms of insuring the vehicle, am I still insuring the vehicle during that journey, or is the licensed fleet operator service providing that insurance? And then in terms of maintenance, who's maintaining the vehicle?
If it's a personal vehicle, you would probably be expected to maintain it as much as you could. I mean, it's an open question as to how much roadworthiness of these vehicles, a personal user will be able to undertake. So, I mean, you would just be contracting essentially for the supervision aspect of the journey back to the train station, but otherwise, it seems as if it would be, you'd be responsible for things like, the integrity of the vehicle itself to the degree you could be. It would be licensed under the no user in charge part of the framework. I think reading through this, it's a little bit hard to envisage vehicles at the moment that will be capable of user in charge and no user in charge. So it's a little bit hard to think about how the initial approval system will account for vehicles like this in the distant future. I would imagine they will need to be assessed, both for the no user in charge aspect and the user in charge aspect. Now, whether that can be done at the same time and how that's done, I think we would be very open to opinions on that. But this definitely seems like it's a vehicle that would need to have a supervisor. You probably have a paid subscription service, which I think is something that we've talked about actually in our previous consultation paper. We talked about you might have no user in charge vehicles that are owned by private individuals, perhaps because they are, I think, unable to drive for whatever reason. And we haven't been specific about different business models, but you could pay for someone to supervise this. You can have it authorized as a no user in charge vehicle when it's being supervised by your subscription service.
And so there would be a need then kind of to identify in which mode it's operating, whether it's in a no user in charge mode and therefore needs a fleet operator, or a user in charge mode, or if I'm using it manually with Guardian, it's not even classed as self-driving. So it depends what mode the vehicle's operating in.
Yeah. And I think we'll cover this a little bit in the next segment, I think, but access to data and finding out what mode a vehicle is in is something that we think is going to be quite important. And I can imagine, and once again, it's hard to think about how these vehicles are going to be authorized, the vehicle that could be user in charge and no user in charge, but that will probably need to be thought about at the approval stage, I think.
I think...
Sorry, Bryn, I was just coming out. For these vehicles, if they're personally owned, there's probably quite an important role of self-diagnostics on the vehicle, so that the vehicle understands if it's capable of going into that non-user in charge mode. and reporting to you, and that's not possible if that is indeed the case. A sensor's failed for whatever reason. Maybe the journey to the station is possible, but the return journey without a user in charge isn't. And so it would need to know that and tell you that.
Yeah. It's interesting as well when you look at the sort of valet parking model, you know, the idea that maybe I'm a user in charge, I get taken to the airport, but when at the airport, it needs to go off and park. And at that point, I'm not looking after the vehicle. I have no oversight of the vehicle and it's out of my line of sight. So at that point, I can't be a user in charge. So that immediately flips into that particular leg of the journey or part of the journey is a non-user in charge. And you know, on the description of it's in a public space that we discussed earlier, but it's not private land at that point. It's
yeah, if I may come in, the way I think about it, and again, as Connor said, it's hard. We will need to learn from experience, of course, but it's about what is the functionality that it's authorized to. So when it goes for approval, is this kind of vehicle, does it have to have a user in charge at all times? And that's one class. And then you have ones which are capable of being authorized and functioning without a user in charge, but that doesn't mean that in practice, it will always be in that mode. So as you say, Bryn, there's a lot of emphasis then on figuring out what mode it's in, much like even if you have, say, a motorway driver, like a driving automation system that drives itself on the motorway, it doesn't mean necessarily that it is always being used. So you have to make a determination if in fact it was being manually driven at the time or whether it was engaged. So it's more a question of what you're authorized to as a maximum. So if you have to have a user in charge, then if there is no user in charge, that you've already breached an obligation. But if it's a no user in charge vehicle, then you figure out what mode it's actually in. And as Nick said, whether it has all the right safeguards in place to be operating safely in that way. And if any of those are missing, then it might be the case that you know, there is a user in charge that is actually operating the vehicle at that time, because it's not in that particular ODD for which valet parking is a great example. So if the fleet operator is only meant to be operating in a particular car parks or locations, that is the only location where you'd have a fleet operator, and in the rest of the operation, you'd be relying on the user in charge. So that would need to be assessed separately in the safety case. It would depend, I think it would have to all be very clearly set out in the safety case, how it is that you switch from modes.
Yeah, super. Well, I think we've run into the break, so we have a choice as to take the break or just to continue through the break. Is there any view from the panelists on what you would like to do?
I don't know. I always think a short break is good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take a short break. We'll come back at 10 past. And we may cover off just a couple of things that we didn't get done here before we go on to the next topic. So, thanks very much. Super. I hope everyone had a good break. Welcome back for the final session, where we'll be looking at the data requirements, so the in-use data required for implementing the framework. We're joined by the same panelists that we had before, so hopefully everyone's returned to the room. I can see everyone's faces appearing, so welcome back. So I just wanted to I think with the polling, we'll do the polling at the end. Jessica, if that's okay, once we've gone through this data section, just mindful of the time at the moment. And Lizzie, if you want to pull up your slides just to make a little introduction around the key points of data within the framework, that would be great. Are you having an issue with them?
Yeah, Lizzie, are you having some connection troubles possibly? Yeah, well, no worries, because the slides are actually just framing devices for us to speak to. So I'm just very happy to give a brief introduction of what the law commissions are.
Oh, here we go. Perfect.
Got it now.
Excellent. That's really good. Thanks. Over to you, Jessica.
Yes, so obviously data is incredibly important for us to know what's actually happening with these automated vehicles, and we can't just assume that we will have access to it. So we need to make sure that the legal system we put forward gives us the right tools to be able to capture the data that we need in order to regulate more in a smart way and in an appropriate way for the reasons of accountability and traceability, which Nick highlighted as also being really important, and aspects which in his work on ethics are key, but also as Ninka said, as lawyers, we're very interested to make sure that we understand the responsibilities in any particular case. So Lizzie, can we go to the next slide? So the starting points that we took are looking, of course, at our international instruments that are looking at the capturing of data. And we have at an EU and UNECE levels, we have different types of requirements that are already being discussed and put in place. So event data recorders, of course, we've got those already in vehicles. They tend to be triggered by significant events like an airbag deployment, so they have quite a high threshold. But what is quite interesting with EDRs, event data recorders, is that they don't tie the results from that incident to a particular vehicle. So the VIN number is actually erased and it's not recorded and held. And this is a trade-off with privacy requirements, which have been agreed, but that poses some quite significant barriers to incident investigation. So if you have data from event data recorders, and as a regulator, you're seeking to regulate the vehicles, but that data is anonymized for good reason, then it is quite difficult to also make appropriate actions, if you will, in respect of the data from incidents. And then you also have, specific to automated driving, data storage systems for automated driving, DSSADs. This area is replete with wonderful acronyms, and we have been introduced to that through the Automated Lane Keeping Systems Regulation 157 at a UNECE level. And that provides various flags and timestamps of different things that are captured by the system. So for example, when the system is engaged, disengaged, detectable collisions, for example, those are all things that might trigger a marker on the data storage system in the automated vehicle. Importantly, again, data is about location is not stored. Again, that was further to concerns about privacy and the fact that you might be able to reconcile quite sensitive personal information by linking location information to aspects in the automated driving. However, again, that poses real significant barriers in respect of incident investigation. So if we can move to the next slide, Lizzie. So one of the key proposals that we put forward in respect of capturing data for self-driving cars, we think, of course, having the timestamp of when an automated system has been engaged and understanding its operational mode is crucial. But we also think that the location stamp of when that ADS was put into action is also crucial for incidents. investigation. We're particularly thinking about soft brush collisions, or perhaps collisions that don't even involve the vehicle itself. So for example, one of the wonderful things with automated driving is that you don't have a reaction time. So the vehicle might be able to stop very abruptly to avoid a collision, but that abrupt stopping might cause vehicles behind it to run into each other. And that could potentially, if that vehicle stopped for no reason, say that it saw a plastic bag or some leaves, on the ground, and it makes an abrupt stop on the road and causes other road users to have problems and run into an accident, then that accident was caused by the AV, but it might not necessarily trigger the onboard recognition system. So we think that linking location is essential to be able to have proper incident investigation and that attribution of responsibility and transparency in what happened. So that's a key element that we are putting forward. Another question that we ask is about who we need to be disclosing data to. And one of the key constituents that we understand will need access to data in order to resolve the civil side of responsibility and paying out appropriately is insurance companies. So we propose that as part of a regulatory scheme, we would provide a right of access to data about incidents for insurance companies. And we've suggested, an outcome-based definition, which talks about the data that is necessary to resolve claims fairly and accurately. That might need some further elaboration, and we'll really welcome views on that. And in terms of DSSAD data stored, there's a lot of discussion about how long one might need to store DSSAD data from. As lawyers, we start from limitation periods. That is the amount of time after which an event occurred, the amount of time that passes between that event occurring and you bringing a claim. So for example, if there was an accident and a collision 3 years ago, I have until today, possibly, to be able to bring a claim. I don't have to do it right when it happened. I have a certain amount of time that the legal system gives me to bring my legal action. And for personal injury claims, for example, it's 3 years. If the person that was involved was a minor at the time, if they were a child, potentially suffering injuries, they have a lot longer. The limitation period only starts running from when you become an adult. So at the far end, it could be a really long time. We know that the ALKS regulation makes a reference to the number of timestamps that it thinks should be stored on a vehicle, which is estimated to be a 6-month capacity. So it's just very interesting to see how we might reconcile the current technical capabilities and the cost of storing data with our current legal system, which actually allows quite a long time before a claim can be made. And then if you don't have the data, if you've wiped the data, you might be prejudicing your ability to defend a claim. So you can't prove that you weren't there, possibly, and you might make it worse. But you could also be prejudicing the ability to resolve the issue in the first place. And there could be a strong problem there for access to justice in case somebody was injured and then there's just no data about that incident. So those are just some of the questions that we are tackling, and we would very much welcome views on. I will hand over to Lizzie to talk about how safe is safe enough.
Thanks, Jess. So as we were discussing earlier, under the AVA Act, vehicles should only be listed if they're capable of safely self-driving. And something we discussed in the paper is what that word safely actually means and what kind of standards should be used. So in our view, to be considered safe, the risks posed by self-driving vehicles must be acceptable to and accepted by the road-using public. People are a lot more likely to accept risk if it's voluntary or if it's something that's familiar to them. With new technology, there comes unknown risks, and that can cause people to be a bit more wary and less likely to accept the additional risk. So there's no single measure of safety. What we do in the paper is discuss several standards and the different strengths and weaknesses of each of those. So the ones we cover are as safe as reasonably practicable, and that's quite a common standard across industries. It derives from the Health and Safety Work Act 1974. And what that does really is involves weighing the seriousness of a risk against the money, time and trouble it will take to avert it. And if manufacturers are etc., decide not to take steps to reduce the risk, then that has to be justified. The next standard that we cover is as safe as a competent and careful human driver. So that's quite a high standard. For example, AVs may be able to introduce significant improvements in some scenarios, but they might not be as good in every scenario as a human driver. And one of the things we consider is if we don't allow automated vehicles onto the roads until in every way they're as good as a human driver, then we might be depriving ourselves of the benefits of AVs in the meantime. So the next one is do not cause a fault accident. So that draws on the duty of care as established in the law of negligence. Essentially, the test is that if behaviour performed by a human driver, if the behaviour had been performed by a human driver and instead was performed by the ADS, but would the driver have been held liable for causing the accident under the law of negligence had they behaved the same way? And lastly, we look at positive risk balance. And that would be sort of assessing whether overall AVs result in fewer casualties than human driving. So we're very open to views on all four standards. And something else that we really considered in the paper, which we're also discussing earlier, was the distribution of risk, and just really making sure that whichever safety standard is used, that the risks are not unfairly distributed to certain groups, such as vulnerable road users or people with protected characteristics such as disability or various others. Ultimately, we're really advocating for a mixed approach. We think there's room within our scheme for all of these different standards, and they might be appropriate at different times. Really, ultimately, the question is political, and is the vehicle safe enough to be acceptable to the British public? And that's something that we think that the Secretary of State should decide, with the assistance of, a specialised regulator as well. So that is it on how safe is safe enough.
Super, Lizzie. Could you just drop back one slide, if that's okay?
Yeah.
So Jessica, when we go back, I think we've had this discussion before. The reason we raised the Molly problem was specifically around some of the limitations that exist around EDRs and DSSAD. So the potential for a child collision or an impact with a pedestrian that isn't detected because it's not sufficiently high in its acceleration to trigger a non-reversible restraint, for example. So there's that very real likelihood that you could have a collision with a child and it not be detected either in the EDR or in the DSSAD. So how within this sort of legal framework, we've mentioned before, there was a couple of terms I picked up, which were the Safety Assurance Agency, the Specialist Investigation Unit, the Safety in Use Regulator. These were all terms used throughout the document at certain points. What's their role in determining, okay, what do we need to make sure the vehicle's safe? I remember you saw one of the quotes was that if the vehicle doesn't record time and location, it can't be classified as self-driving. That could be one of the thresholds, but who sets that threshold? Is that the Safety Assurance Agency? What are those roles?
I don't see the ability to record data as going to whether the vehicle can drive itself. It's more a requirement that applies to vehicles that meet that threshold. So yeah, you still have additional requirements that you have to be able to meet, and we think storage of data is an essential requirement. I think in terms of definitions, I find it less helpful to think of it as going to whether it can drive itself. It's more like a requirement that you put on vehicles. It
can be classified as a user in charge or a fleet operated vehicle, a non-user in charge vehicle.
Well, yeah,
if it can't record data because it doesn't meet the threshold set by the Safety Assurance Agency when it's classifying for use.
Yes. In the same way, there's many other requirements that we think are appropriate to put on, say, a fleet operator. Capital requirements, for example, if you're not solvent enough, you shouldn't be able to put a vehicle on the road. And that doesn't mean, but I think it makes it's less intuitive to say that vehicle can't drive itself. Technically, it's more that you're not meeting the requirements that are required by the scheme. I think in the example you gave of the Molly problem is fantastic to sort of illustrate in a very real way some of the challenges we might face, because if there is a collision with a child, you'll be very clear about where the incident happened. So you'll have a clear idea of the location, but the timing of the incident might not be as evident. There might be quite a significant window of time. And so if you're doing an incident investigation to understand, what occurred and what happened, because if the vehicle just drove away, then it would just be initially, you wouldn't even know that a self-driving car might have been involved. So it could be quite broad at the beginning. So keeping an open mind. The idea of being able to store time and location data when the ADS is engaged is such that as part of incident investigation, you'd be able to identify where the fleet of vehicles was, if it was like a no user in charge vehicle, for example, and if it was a user in charge vehicle, then you would use usual mechanisms, like if anyone saw the license plate or whatnot, and you'd be able to interrogate the user in charge. But if you don't have a user in charge, for example, then it just becomes impossible, to make any nexus with the vehicle. So we think that having a location stamp of when the ADS was engaged is really important. Also, thinking especially of user in charge vehicles, you wouldn't want the situation where an incident occurred and the user in charge just quickly turns on the ADS right afterwards, causing confusion about whether the ADS was engaged at the time of the collision. So knowing the location can help triangulate things and have better transparency and accountability.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, though, that you make the data part of the approval process, if you like, the authorization for use. So that's a really key point I think I wanted to pick out in the framework.
Yeah, and I think also the ALKS regulation, I have to stress, it's not just our idea. Of course, the ALKS regulation is the one that put forward the DSSAD, and it's a really important part of that regulation. And we basically take that on board and work with that, but also identify this additional need that we perceive, especially for those collisions that, as you say, Bryn, may not be obvious and detected by the vehicle.
Yeah, and going back and looking at the discussion we had earlier, if there's a difference in mode between user in charge and non-user in charge mode, at the moment the DSSAD doesn't really have a concept of that. As far as I understand, it's got one mode and it determines whether it's in or out of that mode. But what we were discussing earlier was that ability to put it into a user in charge mode or a non-user in charge mode. So how would that be handled? Would that need an extension to the existing regulation?
No, what we suggested is that when you come for authorization, the vehicle would be authorized as only lawfully used with a user in charge. That's one possibility. So some vehicles, and I'm thinking, for example, it's possible that, say, Tesla or whatnot, it might be only authorized in that mode. It depends on the capabilities, of course, but that's a possibility. So some vehicles will only ever be lawfully used with a user in charge on board. So that's simple, because that vehicle will only ever be operable if there's a user in charge with it. But you'll have, as you were saying, Bryn, some other vehicles that might be more flexible in their use, in which case they would be authorized as lawfully used without a user in charge. So it is absolutely possible to have a passenger passed out in the back seat, and if it's a no user in charge vehicle, there's nothing ostensibly wrong with that, because there's a fleet operator that is accountable and responsible for the vehicle while it's in that mode. If it was a vehicle that could switch between modes and also have a user in charge, then that would be something that would, within the safety case, it would need to be outlined, and I think it would need very clear accountability and systems in place to make sure users weren't confused, because I think that would be a real risk with those systems, that they misunderstood when maybe they might be responsible and when instead it's in no user in charge mode and the fleet operator is doing all the supervising. But I think that's more a question of the safety case. And then, of course, it would need to be reflected in the way that data was stored.
Yeah, and as it is at the moment in terms of the data, so you say with the EDR, is it effectively that's a requirement for all passenger vehicles? Not sure if it applies to commercial. I think it's just from passenger at the moment. But you would make that a requirement for all classes of vehicles, so that would include freight vehicles and buses as well?
Yes, I think if the vehicle can be in self-driving mode, we think that it's important that it's clear that we have good accountability and transparency about when the vehicle is in that mode, regardless of the use case. So yeah, that's something that doesn't depend on the use case.
Yeah, and the same for collision data though, Jessica, is that you're expecting the EDR capabilities, data recording under collisions, to be the same across all fleets of vehicles. Doesn't matter the category.
There might be more data that you need for certain ODDs and use cases. So it's not really for me, that's more for the experts to decide at the time. I think we're trying to identify the absolute bare minimum that would be required in order to support an incident investigation. And we think location data is part of that conversation. So we want to make sure that the very valid concerns about privacy are balanced against incident investigation. So we're very interested to learn more about how that can be achieved. And I know that there are very live conversations. We've been in touch with colleagues that have been part of the WP29 conversations as well in GRVA, and looking at these difficult questions about how much data you can store and the balance with personal data. And I think we just wanted to flag the fact that as we embark on this journey of self-driving, a really big part of that is also making sure that we keep that accountability and that transparency. And in order to do that, we think you need some location data. It doesn't have to be continuous location data. It could be just, it has to be proportionate. And so we're thinking when you turn on and off the ADS feels like a good balance. And it could be that with experience, we learned that there are different requirements that make sense, but that's what we're consulting on. That is what we've suggested. But as you were saying right at the start, we haven't made up our minds on any of this, and we really welcome views about the best way to balance.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting, you go back and you look at the requirements for fleet operators, there was a requirement to report collisions, but also near-miss events. And at the moment, there's no industry standard for defining a near-miss or defining the data that's required for a near-miss. And if you look at the incidents that are related to self-driving rather than just collisions, that need to record, say, 30 seconds before the event to actually work out what was happening in the road environment is more important than the EDR at the moment. Its focus is on the actual collision incident itself. So it's normally limited to about 5 seconds. So it won't really, it tells you this was what happened in the collision, but it may not indicate how you got into the collision event in the first place. So when we look at that culture of learning, what extensions are we going to need to provide the background context of the situation and when action was taken and when things were known about?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'd really welcome views on that. I don't know, Nick and Siddharth, I know you've been thinking about it, and maybe Ninke as well in terms of your work.
Okay, I think just building on what Bryn was saying, there's some work that the UK is doing as part of the BSI and CCAV activity around PAS 1882, which is trying to develop a set of data that needs to be stored and curated as part of incident investigation. But I would caveat that by saying that that's actually for trials. But it's going along the lines, as Bryn was saying, it's plus 30 and minus 30 seconds before and after the incident. One of the aspects that I'm really interested right now is trying to understand if a particular vehicle has both a user in charge application and a fleet operator application. A classic example of that would be, and a very early use case could be an autonomous valet parking system, which is the fleet operation side of things, and a user in charge side of things. Would that mean that the system has two different sets of requirements on the data to be stored? Because one is in a UIC mode and the other one is fleet operation. I'm not sure, but I would be very interested to understand because of the connectivity requirements in this fleet operation side of things. So I was wondering if maybe Jessica, Connor, or people on the panel, Nick, Ninke, have actually thought about if there would be two different sets of requirements around this.
What I can say about the Law Commission proposals in terms of what is specific to fleet operators is the duty to supervise vehicles. So that's what makes it different. That is the essential duty that you have as a fleet operator, is to have supervision and remote assistance being provided. And then depending on your use case, you might have several other things. So you need to have capabilities to help passengers and whatnot. And you need to, of course, be able to also demonstrate that you are complying with those obligations. So you would need to have that. So if, for example, it was a valet parking situation, when the vehicle was in that ODD, you would expect all those functionalities to be in place and to have the fleet operator who is responsible for the safety of the vehicle to be accessing and storing the right data for that ODD and for that use case. But when that use case was not being deployed, and if the system is in user in charge mode, then you would expect the fact of, again, whether the ADS was engaged and the ODD in which it was, and make sure that that correlated with the intended use. As Nick was saying, I think earlier, it's really essential to make sure that we are tailoring the requirements to where the system is actually being used in any particular case. And so the data storage would have to evolve in that way, but we don't have any fixed views about what that has to be. We want to be driven by the safety case and what we need to ensure safety, and have that be the driving force. It shouldn't be, you have some basic legal floors, as I like to think about, like a bare minimum. But in terms of on top of just, was it engaged? What was the time? What was the location of engagement? We think there's absolutely many more data points that could be required, but we think we need to be quite sparing in how we do it.
Nick, obviously, the time and location almost help to look for liability and try and reduce liability gaps. But in terms of a no blame safety culture, do they really add anything? If there's no data about what happened in the incident, how can there be any culture of learning?
Right, yeah, and this topic of traceability, accountability, and then also consent over data collection as well. So GDPR rules preventing forced consent for data collection. How does that work in the context of automated vehicles and that retention of data over long periods of time, especially if it involves any kind of personal characteristics? So yeah, getting that balance right between having enough data to be able to understand exactly what happened and why, and attribute that correctly, but then also making sure that people's privacy rights are respected as well. It's really challenging.
Niki, when it comes to we've spoken about GDPR before, and the sort of issues around data and securing data. What's your views on this? The need to store data against this no blame safety culture, against privacy, and how do you weigh those up?
Well, it's a very tricky balance to strike, basically. What you see right now within the EU is that there is a new general safety regulation coming up in 2022. And from 2022 onwards, it will be mandatory for all vehicles to have an event data recorder. But within the general safety regulation itself, you can see how difficult it has been for those drafting the regulation to balance the GDPR and the need for insurance companies to find out what has happened, for law enforcement agencies to be able to reconstruct an accident, things like that. So location stamp is actually one of the things that is not required for that event data recorder under the new general safety regulations. So Siddharth rightfully pointed out that we might have different requirements coming from different bodies, and that might actually contradict one another. But I'm still quite positive, and I hope that they won't do that in the end. But it will be very interesting to see where the balance eventually lies. I was also wondering in that respect, Jessica, maybe you know whether or not there might be a need to record incidents that are safety-related incidents but don't cause a collision. For instance, ignoring a red traffic light or any other traffic rule violation that has no real consequences in the sense of that damage is caused, but that is relevant when you're thinking about getting a safety culture.
Absolutely. I think that goes to the in-use monitoring aspect. And the challenge is, of course, that if a vehicle ran a red light, there's every possibility that the vehicle itself is not aware that that has happened, because you would think that it was not programmed to do it. So there's some sort of malfunction. It might be that a sensor just didn't detect it, or maybe it was relying on a data set being provided by say the local transport authority that didn't come through properly. There could be so many reasons. And as you say, Ninka, it's essential to understand why, because if it's a problem with the data set that the local authority might be sharing, then we need to know that so that it doesn't do the same for other vehicles, right? And we need to pick that up really quickly. It could be a completely different reason, and that's why we think incident investigation is so important. And the DSSAD and event data recorders are part of it, but they're not the entire solution. And of course, we need to triangulate data from other sources as well. And that's going to be a challenge. And it will be one of the things that we were wondering was, for example, if a automated vehicle were to pass too close to a pedestrian and startle them, and make them feel really unsafe, that would be something of concern, right? Because that person may not feel they're able to use the road anymore. Certainly if that person has a disability, that could have an even worse effect. How can we make sure that we pick those things up? It's already a problem today with vehicles. Sometimes it's difficult to report incidents, and I think it becomes even more important with self-driving. So we need to get creative about making sure that we have good ways of picking up things that might have gone wrong, like traffic infractions, or potentially making other road users feel unsafe.
And Jessica, when it comes to the data, obviously the aim of the focus group that we have is to look at what we require for like in-use data monitoring to sort of validate the safety case almost. So if you've claimed that the vehicle won't come within 1.5 meters of a pedestrian, but it comes within 0.5, how do you prove that? What data do you have, and can you store some data? So in the focus group effort, we focus on what situational awareness did the vehicle have? So was it fully aware of its environment? Did it detect all the objects in the environment that are relative to the decisions that it's making? Is it able to assign the correct risk to those objects, as a pedestrian coming out, or a car that's pulling out of a junction, or a car that's driving too fast? Or things, risk of the related to the road friction that might be there, for example, if it's changing in weather conditions. So kind of those, is it fully aware of the risk? And then does it select the appropriate action, the appropriate mitigating action? They're the kind of three areas that we're looking at as being forming this continual monitoring process. And when there's a threshold, you take the data, feed it into some metrics, attached to the metrics are then some thresholds. And when a threshold is triggered, that then can trigger a recording. So very much like an EDR has a trigger for recording, it's constantly streaming, but will cache record when it gets a trigger event. It's the same, but how do you create that for things like near miss events that you're discussing? So I think they become, for me, an essential foundation to this idea of a no blame safety culture. You have to be open and transparent with everything that's occurring on the road that would be considered to endanger somebody, beyond an acceptable level of threshold for the British public, as you were saying.
Yeah, we think that just relying on incidents will not give us enough to work on, and it won't lead to improvements of sufficient speed. So yeah, we agree that it's important to develop these, but of course developing what they should be and making sure that they strike the right balance of feasibility and that they are actually appropriate measures. The RAND Corporation has done a lot of work in this sphere, and I think that's something that experts like your focus group can contribute a lot to help us actually make progress and see what
it's a topic we'll go through in detail again tomorrow in the main focus group meeting, but I think it's essential. I think Bastian, if you're there, it will be great if we run the poll just while we've got participants engaged, and then we can have a look as we go through. So I think Bastian, you said we'll run each question. Lizzie, I'm happy to read out the questions or to people. That's not a problem. And if you want to add any, well, Lizzie, you can actually read out the questions. I shouldn't take your job, but you can read out the questions. I think the poll will be open for 20 seconds on each question, and then it will close, and then we'll get the results. So, Lizzie, over to you.
Okay, so this is the same question we had earlier, but do you think that legislation should establish a scheme to assure the safety of automated driving systems following deployment, which gives scheme regulators enhanced powers?
I've selected my answer. the poll disappears,
tension in the room,
and then I wait patiently for the results, and then the results shall appear. Perfect. Okay, so that's an overwhelming yes. Then it's a question of what those powers should be, but that, you know, but the principle is there. I think, Jessica, I think that's very clear from the respondent. So if we move to the next question.
Okay, next question. Do you think the regulator should have the responsibility to compare the safety of AVs and conventional vehicles using a range of measures?
And this is really, when you say conventional vehicles, it's also conventional drivers in that sense, human drivers, effectively. So I think that answer is also very clear. I think it's interesting what we look at in terms of what the comparison is and where we get the data for the comparison. And one of the things I was going to raise was that who are we comparing against? And if it's drivers with ADSE systems, if their data isn't available for comparison, then we can't really have this idea of this overall no blame safety culture. So I think it's very important to start looking at what do we need from that conventional fleet of vehicles.
Sorry, Bryn, your audio has become less clear for me. I don't know if other people have felt the same. I was just going to say that if you compare it to a Guardian feature, like we talked before, that's going to be a very different kind of performance than, say, a 1950s classic. But yeah, I think it feels better now.
I'm back.
Yes.
Sorry, you missed me. So next question.
Okay. To do this, the regulator should have the power to collect information on leading measures, for example, bad driving, which could have led to harm.
And this applies to the automated driving system, Lizzie?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it's the whole issue of near misses, really.
Yep.
And that's one element, but I think as Ninka highlighted, it could be an infraction of a traffic rule that doesn't necessarily have that implication.
Yeah. With the Molly problem, we asked about near misses, and we had I think it was 73% of respondents said yes, the same type of data required that would be useful for near misses.
Finding the near miss is the key, isn't it? That's
capturing the near miss, yeah, finding that trigger event.
Nick and Siddharth for that.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jessica. You know what? I mean, we'll wait for the result to come up. So yeah, that's really good. But who defines that? Would you say that was part of the technical regulation, or that's the Safety Assurance Agency defines that?
I think it has to be informed by experts, and again, it needs to be. It depends on the ODD. It's a real composite question, but then it's about the effectiveness of the system, and ultimately whether the system is safe enough, as we've said, is really a political decision, but it has to be informed by solid evidence. And I think you do need the technical experts to tell us what is a valid and good leading and lagging measure, for the particular ODD. And with that information, then you can let those deciding with a particular political mandate as well, to the extent primary legislation is needed, to make an informed decision, which is ultimately theirs. How I see it.
And next question.
So next question is, to do this, the regulator should have the power to collect information on lagging measures, for example, outcomes that lead to actual harm.
So like collision events, effectively.
Yeah, collision events, accidents, things like that.
Yeah.
Because one aspect that I've noticed a lot is the preference for self-reporting, as a mechanism, whereas I think we're trying to highlight the active responsibility that the regulator should have to identify such events and not just rely on self-reporting. So I think Otherwise, it looks like it's quite clear. Of course, we need information like that, but how do you get it, and how much do you rely on the regulatory system in helping make sure that that happens?
Yeah, and that's the power to say to the ADSE, you need to provide me with this information, you need to be able to run these metrics and then report against those metrics, but it's defined by the safety regulator at that point. So there seems to be overwhelming support for that as well, which is great. And then the next question.
Do you think the in-use regulatory authority should be separate from type approval authorities, as is already the case in the UK with the VCA and DVSA respectively?
That's a difficult one.
Yeah. And I think there was some European law that says they need to be separate. Is that right, Jessica?
Regulation 2018-858. Yeah, the type approval regulation basically says that the market surveillance authority and the approval authority have to be separate.
Yeah.
I think Zane actually asked that in the chat as well a couple of sessions ago, and he was asking why is it that we're asking this, and it's for that reason that in EU regulation they do have to be separate. There is the concern that there might be regulatory capture, that whoever the person who's approving it might be caught. Their interests might align with the industry which they're approving essentially, and so it's important that you have a separation. We did talk about this in our first consultation paper as well, and it's important to highlight that a lot of people thought that, at least initially, it might be useful to have them be the same agency. The approval agency might, they might know the most about a given system, so they might be the most appropriate body to actually monitor it in practice as well. So that's why we asked the question in this consultation paper again.
I think the idea of separation makes sense, Connor. I think one thing you can have is common metrics that are used by two separate agencies, one that's used to approve and then one that's used to validate in use. And that can be the link. It doesn't have to be the same agency that does it. So I think that's one of the things. So yeah, next question.
Do you think a specialist incident investigation unit should be set up to analyse data on collisions involving AVs?
So rather than the police, which are responsible at the moment for investigation.
So it'd be a separate unit, and the aim would be that they could sort of build up technical expertise, as time progressed.
Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily replace the police. It can be a supplement to a police investigation, but with more specialist skills. Yeah, okay. I think we have overwhelming support for that as well, which is great to see. And the next one.
Okay, do you think a specialist incident investigation unit should be set up to investigate the most serious, complex, high-profile collisions?
When I saw this question, I was interested in what they would be. So I thought like a multi-car collision on a motorway might be one example, or obviously a pedestrian impact that involves multiple pedestrians. A car's mounted to pavement, a bit like when we've had someone that's had a heart attack in a commercial vehicle and it's killed multiple pedestrians, that type of incident. But I think what's also interesting is when you try to scale that and you say, should it only be those high profile accidents that are investigated? What do we do with that near miss data? And who's investigating those? Because that's a completely different scale problem. So that's another clear response there, which is great to see.
So I should highlight that, of course, these questions are indeed very high level. In the paper, we have a lot of subcategories. We say what leading measures, what lagging measures should you need. I think it's quite tricky in a webinar format with trying to include as many people as possible that may not have read, our 300 plus pages, and to bring everyone together at sort of a level where we can have a conversation. But of course, we would really welcome much more specific views about, the devil lies in the detail. Indeed, the angel lies in the detail. Like the good comes from being more specific about stuff. And that's what we really welcome. So if you are able to send us your views and responses on these issues, hopefully we've whet your appetite about the kinds of questions we're asking. But it's not, obviously you can't draft legislation just uniquely on these big premises. You need to get a bit more specific, although again, not too specific, because then you risk excluding things and hindering innovation. So I think we're trying to navigate that, but this is really just intended as whetting your appetite and encouraging you if you want to graduate from our shorter paper. So this is the one Bren, I think, was mentioning before. So it's not, you know, it's achievable. Like it's still hefty. It's over 50 pages, but still. But then if you're interested, we've got a much more granular discussion of all the issues in here. And in your responses, it's not yes, no. You are absolutely encouraged to tell us about good evidence, good analogies, all the different points, even if we framed the question in a way that you don't agree with. All that is obviously possible in a consultation response. And that's what we really value. So if you're able to help us, we would really appreciate that.
I think, is there a few more questions, Bastian? Jessica, should we go through the rest of the questions? Are you okay to stay on?
Sure, I just don't want to, you know, yeah, of course, if others need to leave, though.
Yeah, so if you do need to leave, thank you very much for joining. I think we'll stay on, probably it's going to be about 5 minutes just to finish off these questions, but Lizzie, if you want to read that one.
Sure. Do you think a specialist incident investigation unit should be set up to make recommendations to improve safety without allocating blame?
So kind of the core to that no blame safety culture, really.
And really in the vein of other accident investigation branches, I should add, all these questions are getting to that. You know, you have the aviation investigation branch, you have a maritime investigation branch, and a rail one as well now. And they're all aimed at promoting a no blame safety culture, producing independent reports which have lessons learned in them. So this is what these questions are getting at.
Yeah, so that looks very positive. So if we move on to the next question, Bastian. 86% of people said yes for that, which is interesting.
Do you think that for a vehicle to be classified as self-driving, it needs to record the location as well as the time at which the ADS is activated and deactivated?
Yeah.
Just while we're waiting for the response on that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, Connor, but if individuals or organizations want to make specific points on one question only in the consultation, they are free to do that, or you can respond to every single question. If you have a topic you're particularly passionate about, you can make that point extensively without doing the full consultation. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Super. Yeah, so 84% of people agree with that, which is really interesting. I think that aligns actually with, we had 88% of people believe that, you know, with the Molly problem, if the data isn't being recorded, then the vehicle shouldn't be on the road. So it aligns with the data that we acquired as well. So last question, I think.
Do you think that DSSAD data should be stored for 3 years?
Now that one's controversial. That one's difficult.
I mean, DSSAD data is quite limited. It's when you then need the data required to do a proper accident investigation is when it sort of starts to scale, and you start to look at, you know, what do you actually mean by what data is required. So but for
even
DSSAD
data alone, we understand the industry is pretty intensive to store for such a long time. That's certainly the feedback we've received.
Yeah, and it's certainly, I think that split a little bit, Jessica, between a vehicle that's personally owned, that might have level 3 functions, compared to one that is an automated vehicle, you know, and the cost of the system is actually what the person can afford is vastly different. So I think you get into a conflict there between what's required and what people are willing to pay for, basically. So yeah, I think that's probably where that split comes in. Super. Excellent. Well, I mean, it's been a fascinating 3 hours. We had loads more content that we couldn't get through, which we said right at the beginning when we were doing the pre-talk that was most likely to be the case. It is a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could come back and do another one, and we'd be very happy to do so, actually, Jessica. Once you have the feedback from the report, come back and do another one and explain what the feedback has been. I think that would be fascinating to everybody involved in this particular panel. So any closing remarks from anyone?
A big thank you from me.
Super, thank you.
I think for me, it's the challenge here is getting the balance right between aiming for perfect, but not throwing out the opportunity to improve. So getting that balance right.
Yeah. Siddharth?
The same thing. I think it's a very important piece of work. Regulations are and could be an enabler or could be a blocker. And I think that's the balance that Nick is suggesting. I think and trying to get our use cases right. I think that would be key over here. Regulation for the right use case would be a boon for the UK.
Yeah, Niki?
Thank you all very much. It's a very interesting consultation paper with lots of interesting new ways of thinking about automated driving and the legal framework surrounding it. So I'll be reading it very carefully once again. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, and thank you to everyone from the Law Commission for joining, Jessica, Lizzie, Connor, really appreciate that. We've obviously got a load of questions that have come up. Some have been answered, some haven't been. We have a load of chat. We have the poll results. I think what we'll do as organisers is download all of that information after the event, collate all of that information and put that together. And then hopefully we can provide that to the Law Commission as a source of evidence for your feedback. So.
Thank you so much. And the questions often, that's where the real skill lies, in asking the right questions as well. So we really look forward to your questions too.
Excellent.
We should be thinking of.
And super, I'd just like to say thank you for the ITU team behind the scenes that we've been talking to that have organised everything, pulled it all together. We couldn't have done this without you, so it's very much appreciated to the whole team. Thank you to all of the attendees. Thanks for all of your comments and all of your questions. And have a good evening, afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Ada, did you want to say any final words?
Sure, thank you, Bryn. And I just want to say a big thank you also to everyone, including the experts who joined us on the panel today, as well as the participants who helped make it such an interesting discussion in the Q&A and the chat. It was constantly moving and a lot of good dialogue. Before we wrap up, I would just like to remind everyone that the focus group is having their meeting tomorrow from 1 to 4 p.m. Central European time. So please join that. We're going to be posting the links in the chat, how to register. So it's a different registration from today for the meeting tomorrow. So we encourage you to join and pick up on this discussion. And also I'd like to encourage everyone to check out the AI Summit's program page to see all of the upcoming and past content on this topic and on other topics. You can also sign up for our newsletter so you can stay in the know. And with that, we have reached the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank again everyone involved, so panel participants, sponsors, partners, and our co-convener, Switzerland. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, and we hope to see you again soon.
Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector. Selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector, rewind selector.